I never knew if I should tell this story. I still doubt whether I should, but I feel it's the only thing I can do to relieve a little of this burden I carry on my shoulders. The truth has haunted me for years, and now that they're gone, I wonder if telling it will make any difference. At least I want someone to know the truth, even if it's just through these words. As I always say, I'll do it using fictitious names. If anyone were to find out, I don't want my family to pay the price for this revelation. But who knows? Maybe in the end, I'll regret it, though it's already too late for that. I remember that summer as if it were yesterday. I was 16 years old when I discovered that everything I knew about my grandparents was a lie. My life, my parents' lives, the lives of everyone I knew crumbled before me in a single afternoon. It all began on an ordinary day when I decided to do something I had never dared to do before: browse the old online news archives of my town. I only thought it was a good way to learn a bit more about my family, about how their stories had intertwined with the town's history. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just something to pass the time. But something caught me. It was a hot August afternoon, and I was in my grandparents' study. There was always something unsettling about that place, as if the walls themselves held dark secrets. Perhaps it was the antiquity of the furniture, or the darkness that never dissipated, even though the sun always shone outside. My grandfather spent hours there, looking at his pocket watch and telling stories of old times that never seemed to make much sense. That day, I decided to do some research on the internet, and for some reason, I turned to local news. It was strange, because I was never particularly interested in the town's history, but something inside me urged me to do it. At first, I found nothing that caught my attention, just the same boring articles about the weather and the Apple Festival. But then, one news story in particular stood out among the rest. It was an article from many years ago. It had been written by a local journalist and talked about a series of strange disappearances in the town. Young children, between 5 and 8 years old, vanished without a trace. At first, everyone thought it was an isolated case, until more and more children began to disappear. The police could never solve it, and the disappearances mysteriously stopped after a few months. What struck me the most was the final detail of the article. There was an old photo of a couple of people who, while not directly mentioned, were somehow connected to those events. It was a black and white photo. In it, an elderly couple smiled in front of an old house with a field in the background. I paused for a long time, staring at that image. Something about their faces seemed familiar, but I couldn't grasp what it was. My grandmother and grandfather, the same smile, the same expression. Something strange began to form in my mind, as if a dark dot was starting to connect with another. After a few minutes, I decided to dig deeper into that news story, searching for more details. I found another article that talked about a secret investigation into the missing children and mentioned a couple who were never formally identified as guilty, but whose connection to the case was never ruled out. And who were those people? My grandparents. A chilling sensation took over my body. It was as if the air became denser and heavier. The comments about them, the descriptions, the connections, everything fit. My grandparents lived back then in the same house where I spent every summer. Years later, I found out they had lived in that very house when the disappearances occurred. The dates matched. Everything matched. What disturbed me the most was a letter I found at the bottom of a digital archive. It was a letter written by a private detective who had been secretly investigating the case. In it, he recounted that he had discovered something horrific. My grandparents had been involved in the kidnappings and murders of children. The details were gruesome. The letter mentioned how the couple had been seen multiple times near the places where the children were last seen. Neighbors spoke of them with fear, and many claimed to have seen them taking strange walks through the woods at dawn, carrying something. I tried to call my mother to tell her everything I had found, but I couldn't. I didn't want to believe it. My grandparents, the people I had entrusted my life to, the ones who always told me childhood stories, gave me candy, and took care of me. I couldn't bear it. For weeks I couldn't stop thinking about it. At night, I would wake up sweating, recalling those details, the photos, the letters. My mind wouldn't let me rest. As my investigation progressed, more dark pieces fell into place. I received an anonymous call on my phone a couple of weeks later. The voice on the other end of the line was low and trembling, as if the person was afraid to speak. I could barely understand what they said, but what I could make out froze my blood. You know, don't you? Everything that happens, it's in your hands now. I didn't know who had called or how they knew what I had discovered, but nothing surprised me anymore. My grandparents never spoke about it. They spent their final years in peace, as if nothing had happened, but there was always a tension in the air. Even they knew. They knew that I knew. We never addressed the topic, neither they nor I. It was as if a silent pact had been established between us. I stayed quiet, observing their faces and feeling that there was a story behind them that they could never tell me. Now, after so much time, I still wonder if any of it was true, or if my mind got carried away too much by curiosity. What I do know is that this secret was never uncovered. No one outside our family knew about it, and it remains hidden there, buried under layers of silence, waiting to be discovered. What hurts me the most, what truly torments me, is knowing that even though they are gone, the truth will never be revealed. And despite everything, I know that shadow will never fade away. In the small town of Amstetten in Lower Austria, there stands a grey 3-story building consisting of an ordinary family home and an attached apartment building. It's a somewhat peculiar structure to behold, a blend of the old and the new that subtly contrasts with one another. But for its owner, the structure was the work of his life. The owner, a retired electrical engineer, had the apartment building constructed in 1978 and even included a rooftop garden for the tenants of the third-floor apartment. Tenants described the owner as reserved and polite, but also exceptionally strict, and of the many rules the building's owner imposed, the strictest of all was the one forbidding tenants from entering the building's basement. You see, the building's owner was a man named William Fletcher, and he had a dark, dark secret. William Fletcher was born in Amstetten on the 9th of April, 1935. His father, William Sr., abandoned his young family when William was only 4 years old. Then, 5 years later, his older brother died in action fighting for the Germans during the Second World War. This left Maria, his mother, to raise young William alone, who later claimed she was both physically and emotionally abusive. At 18 years old, William began attending the HTL Technical College, graduating in 1956 with a degree in electrical engineering. It was also around this time that he married a 17-year-old girl named Madison. In the years that followed, William and Madison would have 3 sons and 4 daughters, including Penelope, who was born on the 6th of April, 1966. But just 1 year after the baby's birth, her father began exhibiting some shocking changes in his behavior. In 1967, Fletcher began stalking a 24-year-old nurse in the nearby city of Linz. He kept his distance for a while, hiding in plain sight among the city's busy streets, but one day, upon discovering that the woman's husband was away from home, he broke into her house, held a knife to her throat, and then raped her. It was also said that Fletcher was a suspect in the assault of another 20-year-old woman, as well as in a reported case of indecent exposure around the same time. He was arrested and later brought to trial for his crimes, but astonishingly, an Austrian judge sentenced him to only 18 months in prison, of which Fletcher served only 12. Upon his release from prison, Fletcher was employed by a construction firm in Amstetten and later worked as a traveling salesman. Unsurprisingly, his remarkably short prison sentence did nothing to reform him, and in 1977 he did something unthinkable and began physically abusing his 11-year-old daughter, Penelope. This abuse continued for 6 long years. Then, after completing her compulsory education at 16 years old, Penelope began a vocational course focusing on the food and beverage industry. This required Fletcher to grant his daughter more and more freedom she fully embraced, as just a few months after starting the course, she fled to the Austrian capital of Vienna in the company of a friend. Unfortunately, since Penelope was still 16 years old and not legally an adult in the eyes of the law, she was returned to her family after being located by federal police. Some believe that, as a way to prevent another escape attempt, Penelope's return led her authoritarian father to become more lenient. But if that was indeed his new strategy, it was nothing more than a ruse. By the summer of 1984, Penelope, now 18 years old, had completed her vocational course and was offered employment near Linz. Fletcher knew he was going to lose her, that there was no way his victimized daughter would stay voluntarily, and so he set to work. For months, Fletcher began working on a not-so-secret project in the basement of his home. He undertook such projects so often that it seems not even Penelope suspected his plans. Then, on the 28th of August, 1984, Fletcher asked her for help carrying a door to the basement. Penelope agreed to help her father, and, after taking one end of the door, assisted him in carrying it to a small, windowless room that looked almost like an improvised prison cell. She began to panic and asked if she could leave the basement. Her father responded by placing an ether-soaked towel over her face before sealing her cell with the very door she had helped carry. Once he realized his teenage daughter was missing, Madison Fletcher filed a missing person report with the local police department. Detectives opened an investigation into Penelope's disappearance, but just over a month later, Fletcher approached the police with a handwritten letter supposedly from Penelope. The letter was postmarked from a town less than 160 kilometers away and explained that she was tired of living with her family. Confirmed to be written in the girl's handwriting, the letter also stated that any attempt to find her would result in her fleeing the country. Fletcher told the police he believed his daughter had joined some sort of New Age cult. In reality, she had been forced to write the letter while being held captive in her father's basement. Over the next 2 decades, Fletcher entered the basement almost daily, providing his daughter with food and other essentials. Since Fletcher made no attempt to use contraceptives, Penelope gave birth to a total of 7 children during her 24 years of captivity. 1 died shortly after birth, but 3 of them, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were allowed to live with Fletcher and his wife after approval from local child protection services. This was only possible because Fletcher's prior conviction had been expunged. as at that time, even heinous crimes like rape were removed from the record after 25 years. Fletcher explained to the authorities, who were already under the impression that Penelope had joined a cult, that she simply did not wish to raise her own children. To confirm they were fit parents, the authorities sent social workers on several occasions, but none saw or heard anything suspicious, and after a few months, the visits ceased. In 1994, and after the birth of her fourth incestuous child, Fletcher decided to expand the underground cell, housing his now 28-year-old daughter and her first 3 children. He put Penelope and the children to work, making them dig dirt with their bare hands until more than 18 square meters were added to their accommodations. It's also believed that their work was incentivized by the addition of amenities like a CD player, later a television with a built-in video player. Fletcher then installed a refrigerator and a hot plate in the basement so Penelope could cook and feed her children as she pleased. He also tasked her with educating the children and punished their failures by turning off the electricity or refusing to bring them food. On one such occasion, Penelope threatened to attempt an escape. Fletcher responded by saying that if such an attempt were made, he would flood the basement with carbon monoxide and suffocate them. He later claimed to have electrified the door of their cell, and that any attempt to free themselves would result in sudden and fatal electric shocks. It was later determined that this was false. Fletcher had not installed such lethal mechanisms, but the prospect terrified Penelope, and along with her captive children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, such threats ensured their continued obedience. As you can imagine, Fletcher spent a considerable amount of time in the company of his second captive family, but he did so without raising suspicion through what a social worker described as a plausible explanation. Fletcher told his wife and tenants that the basement was his office, and since he drew plans for devices intended for use by multi-million-dollar manufacturing companies, his work had to be kept secret from potential corporate spies. To maintain the facade, Fletcher went so far as to create what appeared to be an active workshop in his basement and concealed the entrance to Penelope's quarters behind a total of 8 electronically locked doors. These doors could only be opened using a remote control that Fletcher carried with him, giving him much peace of mind. But that didn't mean there weren't a couple of close calls. One night, one of Fletcher's tenants claimed to have heard a noise coming from the basement. Fletcher promised to investigate, then returned saying he had fixed some faulty pipes and that the tenant would hear no more noises. For 24 years, Fletcher kept his second family as a deep and dark secret, and the level of security he employed gave him no reason to suspect his scheme would be discovered, until one day, something happened that changed everything. On the morning of the 19th of April, 2008, Fletcher entered the basement and found that Kirsten, his eldest daughter with Penelope, was gravely ill. Penelope pleaded with her father to allow Kirsten to be taken to the hospital, fearing she might die. He agreed. Penelope then helped carry Kirsten upstairs, where she saw the outside world for the first time in her young life. The girl was taken to the hospital by ambulance after her mother was forced to return to her cell in Amstetten. It was discovered that Kirsten was suffering from a potentially life-threatening kidney infection, but as Fletcher tried to explain the events leading up to her illness, doctors began to notice glaring inconsistencies in his story. For example, Fletcher didn't seem to know how many children he had. He also presented the doctors with a note written by Kirsten's mother, Penelope, after claiming to have cut off all contact with her. The police were alerted, and on the 21st of April 2008, they issued a public appeal for information about Penelope and her whereabouts. Fletcher claimed once again that Penelope had run away to join a cult, and even went so far as to name the cult and give the police a description of its practices. However, when officers contacted a renowned occult expert, Manfred Wolfart, he stated he had no knowledge of any such organization, fictitious or otherwise. On the contrary, after examining the letters supposedly written by Penelope, he noted some rather familiar indicators regarding her writing. First, despite being a woman in her late 20s, Penelope seemed to possess the vocabulary of someone 3 times older. Second, there appeared to be a pattern of unusually large spaces between every 3rd or 4th word, suggesting the girl had lifted her pen from the paper to listen to someone's dictation. In other words, someone had forced Penelope to write the letter, or had heavily influenced what was written. As the police decided to reopen the decades-long investigation into Penelope Fletcher's disappearance, Fletcher returned to the basement and tried to calm his terrified daughter. Penelope seemed convinced that little Kirsten would die and demanded to be by her daughter's side to comfort her. This is where Fletcher made his first but ultimately fatal mistake in his despicably evil scheme, and that was believing he could stand between a mother and her daughter. Many believe serious threats were exchanged, that a usually placid Penelope became ferocious in the face of her father's refusals. It's not entirely clear what was said during the exchange, but what we do know is that on the 26th of April 2008, he released Penelope and her 2 children, Stefan and Felix, and then brought them upstairs to join the rest of the family. Penelope went straight to the hospital, and possibly hoping to contain the situation, Fletcher followed her. But once there, and following a tip from suspicious doctors, the police detained both Fletcher and his daughter and took them in for questioning. At the police station, Penelope issued the officers a shocking prerequisite for her cooperation. She would only answer their questions if they could guarantee that under no circumstances would she ever have to see her father again. Then, and only then, did she begin to tell the story of her 24 years in captivity. Perhaps one of the worst details the officers heard that day was Penelope's explanation. He showed them adult entertainment using the video player, then forced Penelope to reenact what they saw on the screen while the children watched nearby. Fletcher was swiftly arrested before his relatives were taken into care. Then, the following night, investigators gained access to the underground cell using the secret keyless entry code, looking in horror at the crude sophistication of the construction. On the 29th of April, 2 days after Fletcher was detained, DNA tests confirmed he was the biological father of Penelope's children. His mother claimed to have had no knowledge whatsoever of her abduction or detention. The police believed Fletcher had been planning to stage his daughter's rescue from the fictitious cult he blamed for her disappearance. But in keeping with the agreement that she would never have to see her father again, Penelope gave a recorded testimony on the 11th of July, categorically refuting any such claims. Before his trial, Fletcher claimed that every intimate interaction with his daughter was entirely consensual, but he still knew what he was doing was wrong. An excerpt from a communication with his lawyer read, "I always knew during the 24 years that what I was doing was not right and that I must have been mad to do such a thing, yet it became normal to lead a second life in the basement of my house." Regarding his treatment of the family he had with his wife, Fletcher claimed, "I am not the beast the media make me out to be." Then, regarding his treatment of Penelope and her children in the basement, he explained that he brought her flowers as well as books and toys for the children in what he called the bunker. Fletcher also mentioned watching movies with his second family, but conveniently did not specify their content. When asked why he decided to imprison Penelope, Fletcher was frank in his explanation that she followed no rules once she became a teenager. "That's why I had to do something," he said. "I had to create a place where I could keep Penelope, by force if necessary, away from the outside world." Fletcher also hinted that the emphasis on discipline following Austria's annexation by Germany, which occurred when he was barely a young child, heavily influenced his authoritarian views on obedience to the family patriarch. When asked about his mother, Fletcher spoke at length, saying she was the best woman in the world and as strict as was necessary for a boy of his nature. However, he claimed that his mother beat him until, in his words, he lay in a pool of blood on the floor. "She left me feeling totally humiliated and weak," he explained. "My mother was a servant and worked hard all her life. I never got a kiss from her, and I never hugged her, though I wanted to. I wanted her to be good to me, but she called me a demon, a criminal, and useless. I was terribly afraid of her." Naturally, investigators believed that Fletcher's relationship with his mother explained his maladjustment, and that what he had told them so far was only the tip of the iceberg. In 1959, Fletcher and Madison had been married for almost 2 years when Fletcher's mother asked to move in with them. She was aging and needed her son's help to care for herself. Initially, Fletcher played the role of the exemplary son. He moved her into the attic, kept her comfortable for a while, but over time, his treatment of her began to change. He began snapping at her and ignoring her requests, becoming increasingly insolent over time, until one day his mother realized he was carrying out a slow but terrible revenge. Fletcher gave her less and less food and allowed her less and less sunlight, until eventually she was too weak to move. He boarded up her window, informed the neighbors she had passed away, then cheerfully told his own mother that the outside world thought she was dead. She was his first prisoner, the first woman over whom he exercised total and absolute control, and when she passed away in 1980, it is believed she remained a prisoner in the attic for up to 12 consecutive years. In a report by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Adelheid Kastner, who conducted extensive interviews with Fletcher, she described how her subject believed his pathological behavior was innate, as if he were born evil. Fletcher claimed to have always harbored evil thoughts, but the plan to imprison Penelope came to him while serving his prison sentence in 1967. He believed it would be a way to contain his evil side, saying, "I was born to hurt women, and I held back for a relatively long time. I could have behaved much worse than just locking up my own daughter." Dr. Kastner quickly diagnosed Fletcher with a severe combined personality disorder and recommended he receive psychiatric care for the rest of his natural life. Finally, on the 19th of March, 2009, after an agonizing 4-day trial, Fletcher pleaded guilty to charges of negligent homicide of his newborn son and grandson Michael, as well as decades of slavery, incest, rape, coercion, and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but has recently been transferred from a high-security psychiatric unit to a regular prison, where he can live out the rest of his life in relative comfort. According to a statement from an Austrian court, the now 89-year-old Fletcher no longer poses the same level of danger that required keeping him in a secure psychiatric unit. They added that, due to progressive dementia and physical frailty, he is no longer likely to commit a crime with serious consequences. But can a man like William Fletcher truly be anything other than a clear and present danger to those around him? Or will those like him always pose an imminent and irredeemable threat to the most vulnerable in society? When I was a kid, I thought my Uncle Richard was the coolest guy in the world. He was my dad's younger brother by 4 years, and while my dad was a straight-laced detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Richard ran a surf shop on the beach. He wasn't a failure by any means. That surf shop was a brick-and-mortar business with half a dozen employees and 6-figure revenue. But even so, Dad saw Richard as his slightly wayward little brother, though he loved him dearly. He had a beach house, and every summer we'd go a couple of times to spend the day with Richard and his girlfriend, Natasha, until one summer we were all set to go to the beach when my dad suddenly told us that Uncle Richard was busy and we'd have to wait to visit him. We could still go to the beach, but not to Richard's house. I remember being a little disappointed at the time, but I think I forgot about it as soon as my feet hit the sand. I was only 7 years old back then, so I was still very innocent, and the change of plans didn't seem suspicious to me. What I did notice was that my parents were acting differently and speaking in hushed tones while my brother and I played in the sand. I didn't ask anything. I was too busy building sandcastles. The next day, Mom and Dad sat us down on the couch and told us that Uncle Richard had been in a car accident and had gone to heaven. I'm not going to try to manipulate your emotions with all the details, but losing my Uncle Richard left me very sad for a long time. As these things go, the pain faded over time and life went on. I grew up, graduated, got a job, and was living in Oxnard with a girl I'd been dating for a few years. One day, we drove back to Santa Monica to visit my parents. After dinner with them, we took the highway back to Oxnard, but my girlfriend got quiet and melancholic. I asked if she was okay, and she said, "Yeah, it's just that sometimes I feel weird when I pass through this part of the Pacific Coast Highway." I asked her why, and this is what she told me. 20 years earlier, a high school friend of her mother had gone to stay at a wooden cabin with her longtime boyfriend. She told my girlfriend's mom all about the trip, where she was going, how long she'd be there, and when she'd be back. When the date came and there was no sign of her, my girlfriend's mom started to worry. She wasn't the only one. The girl's parents called the police, told them where their daughter had been, who she was with, and asked them to look for her. A few days later, the bad news came. The boyfriend's car was found after being deliberately driven off the road. He was inside, dead from a broken neck, while she was in the trunk, cut into pieces and wrapped in plastic. The police never figured out how or why the girl had died, or why her boyfriend had driven off the road, but his fingerprints were all over the plastic, so the conclusion seemed obvious. My girlfriend said her mom took the news very hard. She had met the guy several times and thought he was charming. Sometimes she'd get emotional passing by that spot on the highway, as if being there was too much for her. I listened to the story thinking something like, "Wow, that's awful." Then my girlfriend said the girl's name, something like, "Poor Nina, what a way to go." I think I drove for a minute or two before reacting. "Wait, did you say Nina?" When she confirmed it, 2 thoughts crossed my mind. The first, the memory that my Uncle Richard had a girlfriend named Nina. The second, that he had died in a car accident, but no one had ever said it was intentional. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered the boyfriend's name, and I felt a kind of panic rising in my chest. The only calm I had came from a little voice saying, "It's just a coincidence. You're seeing patterns where there aren't any. There are plenty of Ninas, and you're freaking out over nothing." But when my girlfriend spoke again, that little voice vanished completely. She said, "I think it was like Ron or Rick or something like that." I asked, "Was it Richard?" She turned her head quickly. Yes, it was Richard. Have you heard this story before?" I didn't answer. I felt like I needed to focus on the road more than the chaos in my head. The first chance I got, I pulled over, asked my girlfriend to wait in the car, and called my parents. It was almost 9, so Mom was already in bed and Dad was watching TV. He answered. He could tell something was wrong from my tone of voice. "Just tell me what's going on," he said. I took a moment and asked, "Dad, how did Uncle Richard die?" He replied, "You know it was a car accident, don't you?" Then I asked if it was really an accident or if something else had happened. There was a pause, and then he said, "Come to the house tomorrow and I'll explain everything." I felt strange getting back in the car. My girlfriend wanted to know everything, but I couldn't find the words until we got home. I had this irrational fear that if I didn't stay calm while driving, I'd end up dying in a car accident too, like in some inescapable loop from an overly convoluted horror movie. But obviously, that didn't happen. We got home, safe and sound. I went to the fridge, grabbed a beer, and then my girlfriend and I had a long, tearful conversation where I explained everything, including the part where my dad practically confirmed my suspicions with that "I'll explain everything." She kept saying she was sorry, as if it was her fault for telling me the story. But it wasn't her fault. It was Richard's. I barely slept that night, and when I did, I had a vivid nightmare where my dad took me to the garage and showed me Richard's body. I woke up before he opened the coffin, but it was enough to make me get up and splash water on my face in the bathroom, trying to calm the shaking. A few hours later, I was back on the highway, driving to Santa Monica to talk to my parents. I knew it was going to be emotionally tough, and boy, was it ever. Mom was already crying when I arrived, and the first thing she did was hug me tightly and tell me she was sorry they had never told me the truth. Obviously, I already had an idea of what that truth was, but hearing all the details was still one of the most chilling and disturbing experiences of my life. Dad told me the same thing my girlfriend had, that Richard and Nina had gone to spend the weekend at a cabin. He was supposed to return on Monday morning, but that afternoon, he called Dad from the road. According to my dad, he sounded angry, ranting about something that didn't make sense. He mentioned that something had happened at the cabin, but Dad couldn't get any details out of him, and suddenly, Richard hung up. Dad said he assumed the call was from the road because he could hear traffic in the background. He tried calling him at home later, but there was no answer. He tried again the next morning, still no response. That day, as it happened, was when we were supposed to go to his house to spend a day at the beach, but half an hour before we left, my dad saw a car parked in front of our house. He went out, and it was 2 local detectives, people he knew. That's when they told him they had found Richard, and it wasn't good news. Although Dad didn't work in homicide, he got all the details from his colleagues. It was that extra information that made the whole thing so disturbing that they never wanted to tell me about it while I was growing up. The first thing that caught the detectives' attention was that they traced Richard's movements to the cabin he had rented with Nina. It was in the Redwood Deck area, part of a group of 5 cabins that brought in a lot of money for the owners. Normally, these cabins were almost always occupied, except for a couple of weeks during the June gloom. But that September weekend, when Richard and Nina stayed there, the other 4 cabins were empty. There were no bookings. They weren't closed. Nobody had rented them. The detectives questioned the owners, but found no direct connection to the case. Another strange thing was that, on the day Richard and Nina were supposed to return to Santa Barbara, They stopped at a gas station a few hours before he called my dad. The attendant remembered they acted completely normal. Richard filled up the tank, Nina bought a soda, and they left. However, at some point in the next 32 kilometers, Richard stopped, dismembered Nina, wrapped her in plastic, and put her in the trunk. The detectives couldn't determine whether he had killed her before or after the disturbing call he made to my dad. What they did know was that, shortly after, he drove his car off the road, apparently without wearing a seatbelt. My dad told me all this with Mom by his side, holding his hand. He had always been a strong, serious man, but that day was the only time I saw him on the verge of tears. It wasn't just sadness, it was frustration, not knowing why it had happened, what had gone on at the cabins, what those incoherent words during the call meant. According to my dad, nothing Richard said made sense. It was disjointed words, no order. He tried to understand, but he ended up feeling like Richard had lost his mind. He told him to calm down, that he'd call him at home in a couple of hours, but that never happened. When Dad finished his story, I was in a kind of numb state. I had spent the entire previous night going over it, accepting it, and questioning it again, so when they told me the more gruesome details, I was almost resigned. My parents kept apologizing for hiding it from me for so many years, and, in a broader sense, for something like this having happened. I assured them I understood why they did it. How do you expect a kid to process something like that? But that didn't seem to comfort them much. I guess it was all that emotional weight built up over the years, pretending everything was fine and not being able to talk about it. By the time I left, all three of us were emotionally wrecked. When I got home, I told my girlfriend that my uncle had probably murdered her mom's friend. As you can imagine, that sparked a very long conversation. We talked about it many times, and I think that's what helped me the most. That kind of free therapy you get from someone who really cares about you. So much so that she never told her mom what she knew, at least not while we were together. We eventually broke up for unrelated reasons, but I still think about her and how she helped me get through one of the worst episodes of my life, both as a kid and as an adult. I grew up in Greater Manchester in a single-parent family. It was always just my mom and me, so I never knew any different. And while it sometimes makes me a bit sad that other girls had their dads at home, I loved my mom more than anything and grew to be grateful for her as I got older. My mom would tell me things about my dad, what he was like, what he enjoyed, and eventually, how he died. I was still very young when she told me, young enough that she had to explain what it meant. She said that Dad and his friends were on a sailboat at sea, and a big wave knocked them off the boat. Then, Dad and his friends went to the bottom of the sea, and that's when the angels came and took them to heaven, because heaven is much nicer than the bottom of the sea. It might sound a bit grim, but years later, when I was watching SpongeBob, I used to think the sea didn't actually look that bad. Heaven must be amazing. Kids say and think the funniest things, don't they? There's a touch of sarcasm there now. And yeah, that's basically how I grew up. Mom told me early enough that I got used to it, I suppose, so it never filled me with distress or became a source of too much sadness for me. But then came the day when Mom told me the truth, and to be honest, that changed everything. As I mentioned, Mom sometimes told me things about my dad, but only the good things, always just the good things. He liked football, loved a good Indian meal, and had worked for a construction company since leaving school at 16. He seemed like a good man, always took care of Mom, and definitely never did anything like hit her or cheat on her. But when she was pregnant with me, He went on a holiday with friends to Spain to enjoy the last of his freedom before I was born, and took a boat trip that went a bit farther than it should have. The weather turned bad, and that was it. Only it wasn't, because Mom only told me half the story. I was 23 years old when she asked me the question that triggered everything, and I think I knew the moment she asked it that something bad was coming. We were at her house, having tea and catching up, when she suddenly asked if there were things she hadn't told me about my dad. Would I want to know them? I asked what kind of things she was talking about, immediately suspecting they weren't good things, just from the tone of her voice. And she said that Dad sometimes did things she didn't approve of, that she'd been wondering if I only wanted to know the good things about my dad, or the whole truth, who he really was as a man. She wouldn't think less of me if I said no, but the offer was on the table, and of course, I said yes. I wanted to know the whole story. People are complicated, and sometimes good people make bad decisions. I'm also not one to say something as melancholic and pretentious as some truths are better left buried, because I don't believe that at all. And I'm glad she told me the truth, generally speaking, but I could never have been prepared for what she was about to tell me. It turns out I wasn't a planned pregnancy, you see. Mom and Dad loved each other and knew they wanted to have kids. They were also very happy in their relationship, so it was basically inevitable. But when Mom gave Dad the news that she was late, it hit him pretty hard. He didn't take it badly, from what Mom tells me. He was as happy as he was excited, but he definitely had that moment of, wow, I need to step up. Mom said he wasn't the best at work, a good guy, but not the type for a promotion, so it seemed like it would be a long time before he had any serious money. He put his head down at work and tried really hard, but Mom said you could tell he was getting frustrated because he knew it would be a tough road. Then one day, he came home from football with a grin from ear to ear, and when Mom asked what his plans were, he told her with that "don't worry about it" attitude. Mom said he acted like that for weeks, behaving as if he were the smartest man in England. And then, one day, that man disappeared. Not literally, of course. That came later. But the cheerful, carefree version of Dad just vanished. Mom said he acted like something terrible had happened, like something awful was following him, looking at her with wide, frightened eyes, as if nothing was okay, and she'd ask what was wrong, but he'd just lie and say everything was fine, though it clearly wasn't. He was like that for about a week, didn't get any better, and then all of a sudden, he told Mom that he and his friend were going to Spain for that boys' holiday I mentioned earlier. Mom was a bit surprised, but thought she understood, that he was just super stressed about having me on the way and needed some time to relax, so she let him do his thing. They went to Spain, and they were supposed to be gone for just a week, but a week passed, and they didn't come back. Mom started to worry. She contacted the police, and after telling them where Dad had gone, they reached out to the Spanish police, who started looking for him. The Spanish police found that Dad wasn't at any of the places he'd said he'd be, but while there was evidence he'd entered the country using his passport, they found no evidence he'd left, which at least helped narrow the search. So they started checking things like hospitals and jails in the area in case something had happened to him, but they didn't find Dad anywhere. Mom said she had to wait another week or so for news, and when it came, it was devastating. A boat had washed up on a beach in southern Spain, and inside were half a dozen empty sports bags and the bodies of 2 dead men, my dad and his friend. Mom said 2 police officers came to talk to her, those officers who show up to deliver bad news, and they told her how Dad and his friend had been shot at close range while on a rented motorboat that had washed up on the beach after drifting for a few days. Neither the English nor the Spanish police knew exactly why Dad and his friend had been killed, but they thought it probably had something to do with the cocaine residue found in some of those empty sports bags. Mom was baffled because not only was it very out of character for Dad to have anything to do with drugs, but the cocaine must have been what had gotten him so excited, what he thought was going to make him a ton of money. It was a lot to process, as you can imagine. Mom didn't think things could get worse, but they did. It took a few weeks, but things got much, much worse. A week after those police officers came to talk to Mom, they called her again with very unpleasant news. The Greater Manchester Police had obtained a search warrant for our house, suspecting that Dad was involved in a murder that happened before his own death. Mom said the stress was so overwhelming, she thought she might faint. But she didn't, thank God. But it was truly awful. All those police officers rummaging through the house, searching every nook and cranny for who knows what. It was terrible for her, and it took them forever to tell her exactly what was going on. When they finally did, it was even worse than she could have ever imagined. It turns out that around the time Mom found out she was pregnant with me, Dad went into a frenzy trying to make more money. Mom said he started looking into all sorts of things, all legal, of course, but then he met a man at a kebab shop named Giuliano, whose full name was Mustafa. Although Mustafa had moved from Turkey to Manchester many years earlier, he was an active figure in the local Turkish community and maintained many contacts with his relatives in his home country. Dad used to stop by his kebab shop after watching football, and since he was so friendly and sociable, especially after a few beers, they started talking a lot. Dad probably mentioned that Mom was pregnant and how he needed money, because it was Giuliano who told him that if he could come up with £10,000 in cash, he could turn it into £250,000 in just a month. We learned all this because Dad sent a text message to his friend, the one who was also killed with him, and the Spanish police were able to access all the messages because they recovered his phone from his body. Anyway, Dad texted his friend asking if he had £5,000 on hand to go halves with him on Giuliano's investment plan. Dad's friend, of course, was completely skeptical about the whole thing. Like Dad, he needed time to come up with that kind of money and wanted to meet Giuliano to talk it over before handing over a single penny. But after meeting to discuss it, they decided to go through with the plan. Apparently, Giuliano had connections with the Turkish mafia, who were smuggling all sorts of illegal goods into the UK at the time. Back then, British authorities were intercepting a lot of shipments at larger ports, but that made it easier to smuggle things like cannabis resin through smaller, less monitored ports. Those £10,000 in cash would buy a significant, though not highly detectable, amount of product, which would then be sold to dealers in the UK, multiplying the invested money by 20. What Giuliano wanted was a £50,000 handling fee from the sales, and then Dad and his friend would each keep £100,000, an amount of money that, at the time, would have been life-changing for them. So Dad and his friend got the money together for Giuliano. He passed it on to his Turkish mafia friends, and then it was just a matter of waiting while everything got set in motion. A week passed, then two, and meanwhile, Dad and his friend got more and more excited. One day, Giuliano called, but the news wasn't good. The shipment they were expecting didn't come through. Giuliano didn't give many details, just said that the shipment had arrived, but when they unloaded the container at the port, the police suddenly showed up and seized all the product. There was nothing to be done. The money was gone. However, neither Dad nor his friend believed a word of it. Giuliano had been talking for months about how foolproof it all was, how his Turkish mafia friends had been smuggling millions of pounds worth of cannabis resin without the authorities interfering at all. But when it came to their money, their shipment just got lost. According to the text messages between Dad and his friend, Dad asked Giuliano for proof that the shipment had actually been seized. They couldn't call the police directly to ask about the shipment, but what they could do was call and ask if a particular person had been arrested and detained, because that information has to be shared with families or even journalists. Dad asked Giuliano who had brought the container and whether that person had been arrested, but Giuliano said he didn't know the names of those friends of his in the mafia and wouldn't give them up under any circumstances. Giuliano told them that if they wanted to try again, they'd have to come up with another £10,000 in cash, but other than that, they were out of luck. Personally, I think what really drove Dad crazy was that last part. He was completely convinced that Giuliano had scammed him. So, of course, the offer to try again, doubling the amount of money this time, seemed more like Giuliano trying to squeeze more money out of them, banking on Dad and his friend being foolish enough to fall for it. And Dad and his friend were furious. They decided to come up with a plan to get the £10,000 back. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very sophisticated plan, as all they did was tie Giuliano up in a shed and basically torture him until he confessed what he'd done. They told him that if they were willing to try another shipment, this time with double the money, they'd give it another go. Giuliano agreed, and they arranged to meet to hand over the money. That's when Dad kidnapped him. Along with his friend, they tortured him with lighters, burning his hands and feet while he was tied up. But Giuliano didn't confess. They kept beating and burning him, and eventually, Giuliano gave them his bank details so they could take everything in his account, but he still didn't confess to scamming them. The police don't know exactly what happened next, but Dad didn't take any money. Giuliano's account wasn't touched because emptying it would point to Dad and his friend as the main suspects, so they decided not to. What did happen was that weeks later, Giuliano's body turned up. We believe he died while being tortured. The police never found the exact cause of his death, but it's most likely that Dad had to dispose of his body. So, after all that, Dad and his friend made a drastic decision. They decided to fly to the southern coast of Spain, to a place where cocaine smuggled from Colombia could be bought, and then take a train to Madrid, then Barcelona, and finally Paris, to catch a ferry to Dover, avoiding the strictest security at airports. I don't know how solid that plan was, but it clearly didn't go as Dad had imagined, because after meeting someone at sea on a small rented boat, he and his friend were either betrayed at that moment or had the cocaine stolen from them on the way back to shore. The empty bags with cocaine residue make me think it was the latter, that they were intercepted somehow. If the people they bought the cocaine from really wanted to kill them, why would they throw the empty bags back in their boat? It doesn't make sense. I think they were found by someone else, someone hunting small boats doing shady deals in the Strait of Gibraltar, or someone they had really angered, like the Turks. You see, Giuliano was innocent. The police were able to confirm that a cannabis shipment had been seized at the port of Falmouth, so Giuliano wasn't lying. But Dad tortured him for nothing. I imagine those Turkish mobsters were already furious about their shipment being seized and then finding out one of their associates had been kidnapped and tortured. I don't think they cared whether his death was accidental. They just want the people responsible dead. No one knows exactly how they tracked down Dad and his friend, but when there are two English guys looking for cocaine in southern Spain, I guess it doesn't take long for word to reach the wrong ears. It took me a long time to accept the truth after learning all this, because, of course, hearing it completely changed the way I saw my dad. I don't hate him. I still love him, even though I never met him. But I do think he was very foolish. I know he did what he did out of love for me and Mom, and there's a small part of me that loves and respects him for that. But a much bigger part of me wishes he had stuck to something much safer and much more legal, because if he had, I'd still have my dad. I had always been intrigued by what they call the dark web. I'd heard countless tales about its shadowy corners, places no one should venture into, filled with things no one should witness. It might sound unsettling, but that only fueled my curiosity. Nothing, however, could have prepared me for what I stumbled upon when I found the Cannibal Cafe. It all started innocently enough, a late-night bout of boredom, a rabbit hole of clicks, and suddenly, there I was. The website was crude, its design simplistic and dated, yet its purpose was unmistakable. It was a gathering place for people with desires far beyond societal norms. It claimed to be fictional, but the posts felt too vivid, too meticulously detailed. At first, I thought it was just another forum for twisted role-playing, but then I discovered the classified section. Users weren't merely discussing cannibalism, they were offering themselves or seeking others to become their prey. The language was cautious, vague enough to skirt outright confession, but the user's intentions were crystal clear. This wasn't just a silly site for disturbed role-players, it was terrifyingly real. I should have shut my browser, closed my laptop, and gone to bed, but I didn't. Part of me was convinced it was all an elaborate hoax, a perverse corner of the internet meant to shock, and I reassured myself I was just a bystander, a curious onlooker, not a participant. Then I found it, a journal entry written by someone claiming to have cannibalized another person. They didn't use their real name, none of them did, but the way they described it, the chilling authenticity of their words, made it feel like undeniable truth. The writer recounted meeting a man online, someone who no longer wished to live, and they agreed to meet in person. The plan was horrifyingly straightforward. The writer would kill him, dismember him, and consume him, and the man was not only willing, but eager. Reading it made my stomach churn, yet I couldn't stop. The writer described the encounter with an eerie normalcy, as if it were just two friends catching up. They shared a meal first, a real one, almost like a ritual to ease into the horror to come. Then the writer led the man to a room specially prepared for the act. He described covering the space in plastic, laying out tools, knives, hooks, everything meticulously arranged. It sounded methodical, almost clinical, and that precision terrified me. The man, referred to as the volunteer, was instructed to undress and lie on the table. He was calm, even bringing a letter, a sort of contract outlining his consent. The writer claimed he asked one final time if the volunteer was certain, and the man supposedly smiled and nodded. Then it began. The details of what followed were so graphic they made my insides twist. The writer described the knife, the blood, the way the man's body reacted. He wrote about the sounds, the wet, visceral noises, and the smell, with a careful, almost reverent precision, as if savoring every moment. There was no rush, no frenzy. He claimed it was about honoring the volunteer's wishes, giving the act a twisted sense of purpose. He described the flesh, its appearance, its texture, its weight in his hands. He went on to detail how he cooked it, seasoned it with care, and ultimately ate it. I should have stopped reading, but it was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to look away from the grotesque spectacle. It was like watching a car crash unfold in slow motion, horrific, yet impossible to ignore. What unnerved me most wasn't just the level of detail, it was the emotion woven into the words. The writer wasn't bragging or trying to shock. It felt like a confession, a way to unburden his soul. There was a sadness in his tone, a heavy weight, as if the act had altered him in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. He wrote of a strange connection, a bond formed through the consumption of flesh, as if it tethered him to the volunteer in some profound, irreversible way. When I finally closed my laptop, dawn was breaking and sunlight was creeping through the blinds. I felt sick, hollow, as if something fundamental had shifted inside me. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, just a story, but the vividness of the writing, the raw emotion, lingered like a stain. It clung to me as I showered, dried off, and collapsed into bed, only to fall into a restless sleep. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake it. I tried to distract myself, watching movies, scrolling through social media, but nothing worked. The story replayed in my mind, over and over, relentless. I started having nightmares where I was the volunteer, lying on that table, waiting for the knife. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, mouth dry as dust. I swore I'd never return to that site, but the pull was too strong. I needed answers, needed to understand the minds behind those posts. So, I went back. The journal entry was still there, alongside others, more stories, more confessions. Some were vague, lacking the chilling authenticity of the first, while others were even more detailed, more horrifying. I stopped eating meat for nearly 2 weeks. The mere sight of it brought back the vivid descriptions from the site. Yet, I couldn't stay away. I became consumed, spending hours diving deeper into the forum's archives, noticing patterns and connections. Some users seemed to know each other, referencing past events or sharing tips on preparation and disposal. It was a hidden community, a grotesque subculture thriving just beneath the surface of the regular internet. One night, I found a new post from the same user who'd written the original journal entry. He was back, sharing another story, but this time it felt different, darker, more desperate. He wrote about the aftermath, how the act haunted him, yet he craved it again. He described the power he felt, the godlike control, and how he tried to live a normal life, but couldn't. The taste of flesh, the act itself, had become an addiction. He was searching for another volunteer, someone else weary of life. This time, there was no pretense of honoring wishes. It was about feeding his hunger. The reverence from his first post was gone, replaced by a raw, depraved need. He wrote of guilt and shame, but also of satisfaction, how it filled a void within him, offering fleeting peace. For 2 or 3 days, I was glued to the Cannibal Cafe, barely leaving my apartment. I avoided friends, family, anyone who might notice the change in me. My world shrank to the glow of my laptop screen and the endless stream of stories and posts. My dreams grew worse, not just nightmares, but vivid, hyper-real visions. I was no longer the volunteer. Now I held the knife, standing over the table, consumed by a mix of dread and fascination. It took a long, honest conversation with a close friend to realize my obsession with the site was a symptom of a deeper issue, a lingering depression tied to my father's death. It might seem unrelated to some, but I hadn't fully processed my grief. Reading about that cold, clinical process of death and dismemberment forced me to confront it in ways I hadn't realized at the time. That conversation was like flipping a switch, giving me a new perspective. I stopped visiting the Cannibal Cafe, and for a long time, it faded from my thoughts. That is, until I heard about the arrest in Germany of a man who'd actually killed and eaten someone just as the journal described. I'd half convinced myself the site was just an elaborate fantasy spun by disturbed minds, but learning about Armin Meiwes shattered that illusion. It forced me to face the reality that the world is far darker than I'd ever been led to believe. My fascination with the dark web sparked during my second year of college. I was enrolled in a cybersecurity course when the topic came up in a seminar, painted as this enigmatic, almost mythical realm of the internet that few truly grasped. I devoured articles and watched videos about it, some sensationalized, others more technical, and I was captivated by the notion of a sprawling hidden network lurking just beneath the surface of the web we all know. I'll admit, I was intrigued by its darker aspects, but my true interest lay in understanding the technology, the architecture, and the role it might play in the evolving digital landscape. Accessing it was far simpler than I'd expected. I downloaded the Tor browser, which anonymizes online activity by routing traffic through a series of volunteer-operated servers, and for extra caution, I layered on a VPN to bolster my security. Navigating the dark web wasn't like using a search engine like Google, where everything is neatly indexed and easily discoverable. Instead, I had to rely on directories like the Hidden Wiki to locate onion sites, and to learn the ropes, I joined forums where seasoned explorers shared their tricks and tips. Once I felt prepared, I dove in. At first, my discoveries were, at best, surprisingly benign, and, at worst, mildly unsettling. I came across numerous resources dedicated to online privacy guides on using encrypted messaging apps, secure email platforms, and advice for evading surveillance. These weren't tools for criminals. A significant portion of the dark web seemed geared toward people like journalists or activists in oppressive regimes, a perspective I hadn't fully considered until then. There were also plenty of ordinary users who simply valued their digital anonymity. But while some were just trying to stay ahead in this shifting world of online activity, others displayed tendencies that were undeniably disturbing. For instance, I encountered a small but vocal group of users who believed they were targets of what's known as gang stalking. This term describes the belief that an individual is being systematically harassed by a coordinated group, often involving constant surveillance, sabotage, social isolation, or public intimidation orchestrated by strangers, acquaintances, or even government entities like federal agencies. While there have been rare documented cases of organized harassment, it's critical to note that most gang stalking claims lack any tangible evidence and are often rooted in paranoia, anxiety, or other serious mental health conditions. The level of fear these individuals experienced led them to interpret everyday occurrences as deliberate threats, sometimes with devastating consequences for their loved ones. The discussions I witnessed on gang stalking forums were as disheartening as they were unnerving. People's lives had unraveled, yet instead of seeking support from friends or family, they turned inward, forming secretive online communities where they reinforced each other's delusions, occasionally with what seemed like deadly outcomes. For me, exploring the dark web began as an academic curiosity, but quickly evolved into something more profound. It forced me to think critically about privacy, surveillance, and how technology shapes our freedoms. The dark web didn't strike me as inherently good or evil. It was merely a tool, and what mattered most was the intent of those wielding it. But the longer I spent exploring, the more I inevitably stumbled upon hints of its darker underbelly. It was a gradual descent, like peeling back layers of something you're not entirely sure you want to uncover. There were whispers of marketplaces, trafficking in illegal goods, forums discussing activities that were blatantly unethical or outright criminal. I wasn't actively seeking these things. They were just there, scattered among the more innocuous content. The rumors about so-called red rooms were what marked my tentative first steps into the dark web's more sinister corners. These were said to be live-streamed events where unspeakable acts were performed for a paying audience using cryptocurrencies. Some dismissed them as urban legends, exaggerated or entirely fabricated to inflate the dark web's infamy, while others described them with chilling specificity, detailing how you needed hidden links and hefty payments to gain access. Though I hadn't yet seen anything to confirm their existence, the mere idea sent shivers down my spine. What truly unsettled me about the dark web's shadowy recesses was the casual way some users discussed such depraved topics in certain forums. They spoke of morally reprehensible acts as if they were mere curiosities, stripped of any ethical weight. It felt like stepping into a realm where societal norms had been discarded and anonymity had birthed a space where anything, no matter how horrific, could thrive. Despite the darkness, I kept reminding myself why I was there: to understand, not to engage. I was meticulous about avoiding suspicious links or venturing too far into places I didn't belong. Still, the weight of what the dark web could be was impossible to ignore. For every encrypted email service or activist forum, there seemed to be an equally sinister counterpart lurking in the shadows. The rumors about red rooms lingered in my mind as I continued my exploration. They were whispered about in forums and chat rooms, always elusive, always unverified. Initially, I brushed them off as digital folklore, the product of overactive imaginations. But the more I read, the more I realized they weren't entirely myths. It felt like a disturbing puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, yet I couldn't resist trying to uncover the truth. My search began in forums where users claimed insider knowledge. Their posts were cryptic, filled with vague hints and coded language. Some described red rooms as pay-to-view live streams where horrific acts were performed, often tailored to the audience's requests. Others scoffed at the idea, citing the technical challenges of streaming live video anonymously over Tor. Yet, there were enough detailed accounts to keep me hooked, making me wonder if some twisted corner of the internet had found a way to make it real. I followed the breadcrumbs cautiously, navigating layers of forums, chat rooms, and directories. But the deeper I went, the heavier the atmosphere felt, darker, more oppressive. I stumbled upon sites with names that sounded like warnings, their stark black and white pages filled with ominous links. Some required passwords or cryptocurrency payments to proceed, and I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a line I couldn't uncross, but a part of me was driven by an insatiable need to know. Were these dead ends, or were they the real deal? The most unsettling moments came when I found threads where users claimed to have witnessed these supposed events. They spoke of encrypted invitations, exorbitant Bitcoin payments, and fleeting access to streams hosted on obscure servers. It was surreal, but the way they described it felt disturbingly plausible. I never found anything definitive, no working link, no concrete proof, but the search itself was chilling. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that even the pursuit carried risks, not just of stumbling upon something horrific, but of crossing a moral boundary I wasn't prepared to breach. Whether red rooms truly exist or not became almost irrelevant, because the hunt itself revealed a haunting truth about what people are capable of imagining and perhaps doing. I logged off, shaken by the experience, but also oddly relieved that I hadn't found what I was chasing. The rumors remained just that, rumors, but the darkness I glimpsed along the way felt all too real. Yet that sense of being so close to uncovering something kept pulling me back into the rabbit hole. I still vividly recall the moment I found it. It was the culmination of weeks spent chasing cryptic threads, pursuing whispers, and piecing together fragments of a puzzle I wasn't even sure I wanted to complete. It appeared unexpectedly after hours of navigating hidden forums and dead links. A new thread had popped up in one of the darkest corners of a forum, posted by someone claiming to have access to a genuine red room. The post was brief. A terse description, a heavily encrypted link, and a demand for payment in Bitcoin. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to close the browser and walk away, but I couldn't. The curiosity that had brought me this far refused to let me quit. I transferred the required Bitcoin, a sum that made my chest tighten as I watched it leave my wallet, and followed the instructions. The link led to a blank page with a countdown timer. It felt unreal, like stepping into the set of a horror movie. I waited, my heartbeat quickening as I questioned every choice that had led me to this moment. When the timer hit 0, the screen flickered and a grainy video feed appeared. The room was stark and clinical, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast sharp shadows across the walls. A man in a lab coat stood at the center, surrounded by makeshift equipment, medical monitors, steel tables, and tools whose purposes I didn't want to imagine. The camera panned slowly, revealing a figure strapped to one of the tables. They were conscious, but their face was twisted in terror, their muffled screams barely audible through a gag and the poor audio quality. A chat panel next to the video sprang to life with activity. Anonymous viewers typed messages, some urging the host to proceed, others requesting specific acts or experiments. It was horrifying, not just because of what I was seeing, but because of the audience's nonchalance. They treated it like entertainment, something to consume, as if the person on the table wasn't even human. I don't know if they believed it was staged or fake, but to me, it looked sickeningly real. The experiments began, and I could barely stomach it. The host used injections, electric currents, and other devices that seemed designed to test the limits of pain or biological responses. The victim writhed and screamed, their agony palpable through the screen, and the audience cheered, their demands growing more viciously cruel with each passing moment. It was unlike anything I'd imagined, pure, unfiltered sadism masquerading as some twisted form of scientific inquiry. I don't know how long I watched before I forced myself to close the browser and slam my laptop shut. I sat there in silence, feeling nauseated. My hands trembled, and an overwhelming wave of guilt washed over me for having gone this far. The reality of what I'd witnessed was far worse than any rumor or legend. This wasn't a myth. It was real, happening somewhere, hidden in the depths of this shadowy network. That night, I deleted everything: the Tor browser, my Bitcoin wallet, the notes I'd kept of my search. I wanted no trace of what I'd done, no connection to the sickening, terrifying world I'd glimpsed. But those images stayed with me. They're things I'll never fully forget, a burden I'll carry for the rest of my life, and I suppose that's something I have to live with on my own. The murky void of the dark web is a foul swamp, a breeding ground where society's most depraved urges simmer and thrive unchecked. That's my domain. I'm what they call a white hat operative, a kind of online guardian compensated to dismantle sinister bazaars, follow the convoluted trails to the beasts hiding in the shadows, and cast a dim beam into that obscurity. On typical days, I'm bent over my displays in my chaotic flat, the screen's icy radiance, my sole light source, as my digits fly over the keys, slicing through veils of coded muck to reveal truths others wouldn't dare approach. It's my vocation, not suited for the timid, but I'm exceptionally skilled at it. I've beheld atrocities defying imagination sights no soul should endure. But the incident that torments me commenced on a mundane afternoon, amid a standard patrol that guided me to a bazaar entombed far beneath the internet's surface. It traded in human existences as if they were mere goods, the young and elderly alike, accompanied by polished snapshots and eerily impersonal narratives. I'd encountered similar hubs previously, yet this one exuded a distinct vibe, polished, expert, and unnervingly quiet, resembling a virtual stronghold, taunting intruders to assault its barriers. I recall plunging into its framework, dissecting its safeguards, like stripping the skins from a bulbous vegetable. It was tedious, exhausting labor, infuriating on occasion, and the platform's macabre sophistication shone through in its protections, engineered by an individual well-versed in the craft. However, no fortress is utterly impenetrable. By the conclusion of the third evening, I had penetrated it. The repository was immense, a somber inventory of sufferers' identities, years, portraits, and portrayals so alarmingly exact they knotted my insides. Every record was a muted cry, a supplication inscribed in binary code. I initiated the withdrawal of the information, assembling motifs, titles, and linkages, scrupulously documenting all to construct a dossier that might assist enforcers once the hub was eradicated. Then I stumbled upon her, a youngster from the Philippines, scarcely beyond 11 summers. Her image depicted a kid with broad, petrified gazes and a coerced grin that failed to illuminate them. Her dossier was elaborated in a manner that twisted my core, but another element seized my attention, an odd annotation in the auxiliary data, a virtual trail marker negligently abandoned. It was a transaction log, and it didn't point to a purchaser. It looped back to her kin. This discovery halted me cold. My pulse quickened as I scrutinized the entry, the cursor hovering like a hesitant predator. In my line of work, I've learned to trust those subtle anomalies. They're often the cracks that lead to the heart of the evil. But this one felt personal from the start, a whisper of something more insidious than the usual transactions. I minimized the marketplace window and fired up my array of search tools, feeding her name into every accessible archive. International missing persons registries, fragmented social network scraps pulled from the surface web, and obscure news clippings from regional outlets. The path was tenuous, flickering like a dying ember, but persistent. She'd evaporated several months prior, final sighting in a remote hamlet, with provincial bulletins scarcely acknowledging it. Peculiarly, her guardians had never filed a disappearance report. Rather, their circumstances veered into the bizarre. I unearthed their social profiles on platforms like Facebook, brimming with images of them posing triumphantly before a freshly erected dwelling, crowing about an abrupt fortune, displaying opulent attire, extravagant gatherings, and contrived beams. It jarred against logic. How does an impoverished household abruptly acquire such prosperity? The fragments coalesced, forging a hideous mosaic I regretted assembling. They'd bartered her, their blood relative delivered to fiends for a sliver of affluence. The realization struck like a physical blow. I leaned back in my creaky chair, the room spinning slightly as nausea surged. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of controlled chaos, with empty coffee mugs and tangled cables, suddenly felt claustrophobic. It wasn't merely the bizarre, it was the treachery, the desertion, the ruthless arithmetic that reduced a youngster to barter, I'd perpetually maintained my endeavors, clinical, aloof, an essential shield to preserve my mental stability. Yet this instance pierced that armor. She transcended a mere entry in a ledger. She was a child tossed aside like garbage, her existence fractured by those duty-bound to safeguard her. The weight of it pressed on my chest, making each breath labored. I couldn't stop there. Compulsion drove me onward. I burrowed further, infiltrating their financial ledgers through backdoor accesses I'd cultivated over years, sifting through confidential correspondences, any fragment within reach. Each exchange narrated a tale, and the evidence was condemning. An influx aligning with her vanishing, succeeded by a relentless indulgence in extravagances. They weren't simply involved, they were prospering from her agony. The deeper I delved, the more fury infiltrated my veins, a gradual smolder I couldn't extinguish. My role was to dismantle networks, not condemn persons, but this resonated profoundly intimate. Her likeness pursued me, that artificial smirk, the dread in her orbs. Regardless of effort, I couldn't dispel it from my thoughts. That night, sleep evaded me. I paced the dim confines of my living space, the city lights filtering through blinds like accusing fingers. Memories of prior operations flooded back, dismantling a ring peddling counterfeit identities that funded terror cells, or exposing a forum where assassins bartered contracts like stock trades. Those victories had been clean, detached triumphs. But this gnawed at my soul. I returned to my workstation at dawn, red-eyed and resolute, expanding my probe. I cross-checked the family's communications with timestamps from the marketplace logs. There it was, a cryptic message from the father to an unknown contact, veiled in euphemisms about securing the future and making the hard choice. It was veiled, but to my trained eye, damning. Suspense built as I anticipated countermeasures. Dark web operators often employ tripwires, digital alarms that could alert them to my intrusion. Had I triggered one? My heart raced during each query, fingers hovering over escape protocols. Twice, I thought I detected shadows in the code, phantom accesses that might indicate pursuit. Paranoia set in. Was someone watching me watch them? For weeks, I amassed proof, forging a file impervious to doubt. The officials would assume control. Thereafter, that's the protocol. But daily, the notion of her relatives basking in luxury while she endured eroded my resolve. They'd purchased their joy with her essence, and that was abominable beyond expression. One evening, as I combed the ultimate datasets, a pivotal decision crystallized. I wouldn't merely submit the dossier and depart. I'd compel them to confront the gravity of their deeds. They couldn't persist, as though unscathed, ignorant of the devastation they'd wrought. I fashioned an incognito, untrackable dispatch, appending snapshots of their offspring from the bizarre obscured sufficiently to uphold her honor, yet identifiable. I dispatched it sans verbiage, solely the visuals. I yearned for them to behold her, to recollect their transgression. I'll never ascertain if they viewed it, but I envisioned the remorse corroding within like decay, devouring their vacant existences. It wasn't equity, but it was a measure. Yet the act didn't bring closure. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of doubt. Had I crossed an ethical boundary? White hats operate in gray zones, but personal vendettas were taboo. They could compromise operations, draw unwanted scrutiny. I monitored their profiles obsessively in the following days, seeking signs of disruption. At first, nothing. More posts of feigned bliss, vacations to beaches they'd never afforded before. Then, subtle shifts emerged. The mother's updates grew sparse, laced with vague laments about past mistakes haunting us. The father's bravado waned, a photo of him alone, eyes hollow, staring into the distance. Was it guilt or coincidence? Suspense mounted as I wondered if they'd alert authorities, or worse, if the traffickers would trace the email back to me. My apartment felt exposed. I double-checked locks, installed additional firewalls, even considered relocating temporarily. The bazaar evaporated shortly thereafter, purged from the shadowy depths. My mission concluded, and the enforcers possessed the intelligence to commence unraveling the syndicate. But her visage persists, a specter I can't banish. I cling to optimism that she's enduring, that the apparatus I aided in shattering afforded her liberation, yet inwardly I recognize the grim reality. The obscure net relinquishes its captives reluctantly. Nonetheless, I persist in my labors, toppling one abomination after another, for if not me, then whom? As the weeks blurred into months, the aftermath of that case lingered like a persistent fog. I threw myself into new assignments, hoping to drown the memories in code and caffeine. One involved infiltrating a cryptocurrency laundering scheme tied to arms, dealers, tedious number crunching, but safer emotionally. Yet, during lulls, my mind wandered back to her. I began anonymous inquiries through secure channels, reaching out to contacts in international NGOs focused on trafficking rescues. Whispers returned. A raid in Southeast Asia had freed several miners from a compound linked to similar marketplaces. Was she among them? Descriptions were vague, identities protected, but one detail matched. A girl with haunted eyes from a rural Philippine village. Hope flickered, fragile and tentative, but doubt shadowed it. What if my intervention had endangered her further? Traffickers often relocate assets at the first sign of breach. I revisited the archived data, poring over logs for clues I'd missed. There, buried in transaction chains, was a secondary buyer, a shadowy figure with ties to an even deeper network. Panic surged. Had I only scratched the surface? Suspense built as I launched a covert follow-up probe, navigating onion routers with heightened caution. Alarms blared in my mind. Each layer peeled risked exposure. One night, my system pinged an anomaly, an inbound probe, sophisticated and probing. Was it them? I severed connections, heart pounding, sweat beading on my brow. For hours, I scanned for breaches, fortifying defenses like a besieged castle. The incident shook me, forcing a rare break. I stepped away from the screens, wandering the city's rain-slicked streets, anonymity my cloak. Reflections in puddles mocked me. Who was I to play judge? Yet, the alternative in action was unbearable. Returning invigorated, I expanded my toolkit, incorporating AI-driven pattern recognition to flag anomalies faster. The girl's case became my benchmark, a reminder to blend detachment with determination. Months later, a breakthrough. An Interpol bulletin crossed my feeds, detailing arrests in the Philippines. Among the charged, a couple from a small village, accused of child endangerment and complicity in trafficking. Photos matched her parents, faces gaunt, the opulence stripped away. Had my email tipped the scales, or was it coincidence? Satisfaction mingled with sorrow. Justice tasted bittersweet. Their downfall didn't restore her innocence, but it severed one link in the chain. Today, I continue the fight, screens aglow in my cluttered haven. The dark web evolves, monsters adapt, but so do I. Each takedown honors her memory, a faint light against the abyss. The horrors persist, but as long as breath fills my lungs, I'll pierce the gloom, one keystroke at a time. Expanding further into the intricacies of my craft, I recall the initial breach in vivid detail. The marketplace's front end was deceptively simple, a login portal masked as an innocuous forum, but beneath lurked Tor hidden services, encrypted with elliptic curve cryptography that would stump lesser hackers. I employed custom scripts, blending Metasploit frameworks with personal tweaks, probing for vulnerabilities. Hours turned to days. Coffee grew cold, eyes strained. A SQL injection flaw finally yielded a tiny oversight in input sanitization. Triumph surged as data flooded in, but so did revulsion. Entries detailed products with specs like height, weight, compliance level, clinical terms masking human tragedy. Her file stood out amid hundreds. Name, Maria, pseudonym for protection. Age, 12. Origin, rural Philippines. The photo, time-stamped recently, showed bruises artfully concealed. Metadata revealed GPS coordinates, sloppy on their part, invaluable to me. Cross-referencing with satellite imagery pinpointed the upload site, a nondescript warehouse in Manila's outskirts. Suspense peaked as I debated alerting locals prematurely risk alerting the operators. Investigating her family deepened the nightmare. Father, a fisherman scraping by. Mother, homemaker. Social posts, pre-disappearance. Humble pleas for aid during typhoons. Post, lavish upgrades, a new roof. Gadgets, trips. Bank hacks via phishing simulations revealed offshore accounts. Deposits from untraceable wallets. Private DMs. Father's guilt-laced rants to a brother. We had no choice. The debts. Mother's tearful confessions in a hidden group chat. Each revelation built tension, like tightening a noose. My moral quandary intensified. Colleagues in the hacker community, anonymous chats, on secure forums advised restraint. Stick to the code, one urged, but her eyes pleaded otherwise. Crafting the email was meticulous, routed through multiple proxies, headers scrubbed, attachments, redacted images, enough to evoke horror without exploitation. Post-send, I monitored via botnets. Their devices showed spikes in activity-frantic searches for dark web exposure, deleted posts, arguments captured via compromised webcams. The father's breakdown, sobs in the night, mother's withdrawal, isolation, therapy apps downloaded. It was voyeuristic, but validating. The site's demise involved coordinated DDoS attacks, data leaks to authorities, but echoes remain. I've since mentored aspiring white hats, stressing emotional resilience. Her story fuels me, a cautionary epic in the endless war against digital darkness. The abyss stares back, but I stare harder, unyielding. In early 2013, I was working for a large market research company here in New York City. I had been there for 6 years, was very happy, and my career prospects were bright. But one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday morning, and after waking up at 6:15, I completed my morning routine and then walked to my building's parking lot. Mine was one of maybe 12 or 14 cars in the lot. As I approached, I saw a lone figure leaning against the wall near the hood of my car. It appeared to be a young man in his early to late 20s, wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie. As I walked toward my car, the guy just stared at me. I held his gaze, cautious but not confrontational. When I reached my car, I asked if I could help him. I wasn't overly confrontational about it, but he was standing by my car and clearly staring at me, so I figured it was best to clarify what his deal was before opening the door. I asked, "Can I help you?" And without missing a beat, he replied, "Nobody can help you, pal." I assumed he was just trying to be a smartass, so I decided not to engage, got into my car, and started backing out of the parking space. But as I did, the hoodie guy just stared, grinning ear to ear, as if his little "nobody can help you, pal" comment was the ultimate mic drop. During the drive to work, I was cut off or flipped off maybe a dozen times, all in the span of 30 minutes. By the time my boss's annoying midweek meeting wrapped up, I had pretty much forgotten about the hoodie guy and his absurd comment. I went on with my day as usual, which is actually quite busy, so it wasn't until the afternoon that the encounter came back to mind. I assumed the guy was there to steal a car, or maybe pull a quick smash and grab for some valuables. Someone in my apartment building was about to have a really bad day. But little did I know that while my car was safe in the employee parking lot, I was the one about to have that really bad day. So the workday ends, I drive back home, and as I pull into the parking lot, I don't see any broken windows or glass in the empty spaces, so I thought we'd been spared. But then, after climbing the stairs to my apartment's floor, I turned a corner in the hallway and saw it, or rather, smelled it. Someone had defecated all over my door. This wasn't normal excrement. I'm talking liquid diarrhea from the splatter pattern, and it looked like it had hit my door with some force. I remember staring at it for a second in complete disbelief, thinking, please, God, no, this can't be happening right now. When the smell hit my nostrils, I had to cover my nose and mouth to keep from vomiting. I went straight back to my car, called an emergency cleaning company, and then the building management to get copies of the security camera footage. All our main doors and hallways had cameras, which was one of the reasons I chose to rent there in the first place. The process of contacting management and getting copies of that day's footage was quick and very easy. After the emergency cleaners came, and I tipped them well for the urgency of the job, I was able to get into my apartment probably around 9:30. I made coffee, sat down with my laptop, and started reviewing the footage that building management had uploaded to an online Dropbox for me. It took a while to get to the right section of the footage, but at some point in the afternoon, a hooded figure approached the main entrance of my apartment building. This guy was also wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap, but unlike the guy in the parking lot that morning, this one seemed to be wearing a fluorescent vest while carrying a package. Assuming he was a delivery person, I thought he'd walk to an apartment, drop off the package, then turn around and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked to my apartment, set the package down, then pulled down his pants, and as you know, defecated all over my door. When he was done, he didn't even wipe, just pulled up his pants and walked out of the building so calmly it seemed like an everyday thing for this guy. I could hardly believe what I was seeing, but there it was, clear as day. Maybe the strangest thing for me at the time was that it wasn't the same hoodie and cap guy I'd seen that morning, or at least I was 90% sure it wasn't. He was too tall, too broad. Though I had a strong hunch the two were connected, I had no idea why I was being targeted. I called the police, but they were no help, and even suggested I rule out the possibility of it being a friend pulling some kind of prank. After politely explaining that I didn't have friends who'd defecate on my door, they said they'd follow up if there were any developments, and chuckled a bit. But I was the one who called them back the next morning. I woke up at 6:15, completed my morning routine, then walked to the parking lot to find my car nearly destroyed overnight. I called work, told my boss what happened, and he, very kindly, gave me the day off so I could talk to the police and arrange alternate transportation. When I called the police, I spoke to a different department about the car vandalism, but they seemed just as useless as the first time I called. They said they'd review any security camera footage I could provide, but since the hooded figures' faces were covered, I knew they couldn't do much with it. I could barely muster the motivation to email the footage to the address they gave me. By the afternoon, I started having some very worrying thoughts. Since I was obviously being targeted at home, it seemed insane to keep staying in my apartment. So, after my car was towed for repairs, I found a 3-star hotel with some vacancies nearby and took a cab there to book a room. I called my dad from the hotel room just to ask for advice and such, and he agreed it was very concerning that this group of people seemed to know where I lived. It was one thing for some jerk to vandalize my car after seeing me drive it, but it was another for this hooded defecator to know exactly which door to do his business on. There was also a clear pattern of escalation, so, logically, the next thing they'd try would be attacking me in my apartment, which, it turns out, is exactly what they attempted. I had no idea who they were, and technically I still don't, but at the time, that made everything doubly terrifying and confusing for me. How the hell had a conflict like this started so suddenly over a staring contest and a brief exchange of words? And who the hell were the guys targeting me? Were they a gang or something? Were they brothers, cousins, maybe just friends? And had I just pissed off the wrong lunatic? On top of all that, how far were these guys willing to go? Well, apparently, all the way to breaking into my apartment and trashing the entire place. Remember how I mentioned booking that hotel room while deciding whether I'd stay there for a week or longer? I decided to go to my apartment to take care of some things and grab some home comforts to bring back to the hotel. After work, I took a cab back to my apartment, climbed the stairs, and what do you know? My apartment door was hanging off its hinges, and one of my neighbors was standing there, looking like he'd seen a ghost. When I walked in, I understood why. Whoever broke into my apartment had trashed the whole place. The glass in my shower was shattered, they destroyed my bed frame, and the TV room and kitchen were carpeted with shards of glass and porcelain from where they'd been taking batting practice with the contents of my cabinets. That's a terrible baseball reference, by the way. They ripped down all the artwork on my walls. My TV and laptop were smashed. But by far, the worst and most painful thing was that they broke my fish tank and killed all my fish. I was devastated, genuinely soul-crushed. Messing with me and my stuff, fine, but drowning my fish like that, hurting innocent creatures just living their happy SeaWorld lives. It took everything I had not to have a complete breakdown in front of my neighbor. Now, an hour later, I'm back in my hotel room and facing two cold, hard facts. First, I was going to have to call the police for the 3rd time in as many days. Second, I had no choice but to find another place to live. But still, the thread running through all 3 days and what had me practically grinding my teeth in frustration was, obviously, the why. It didn't make sense. Not anymore. Some psychopath trashing my car and defecating on my door because we had a minor standoff. There was a kind of perverse logic to that, especially if it was some drugged-up vagrant. But I was left wondering if, had I been home that night, would they have killed me? And how had they managed to escalate things to the point that, in just 3 days, all this came from a minor standoff? It was like a nightmare, one I'd have given anything to wake up from, but it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. First, when I got the security camera footage from building management, who by this point weren't thrilled with all the trouble I was bringing home, I saw the usual suspect, so to speak. Instead of a group of hoodies breaking into my apartment, similar to the group that had trashed my car, these guys looked different. They were dressed all in black, with masks and gloves. They looked professional, almost terrifying. It was at that moment I decided I'd never rest my head there again. I started looking for new places to live, but then, a few days later, there was another serious escalation, one that made me realize finding a new place to live might not solve anything at all. I had started using the subway to commute to and from Grand Central, but that meant walking several blocks from the station to our office building. I didn't mind too much. It gave me a chance to grab some food after work, and the subway seemed considerably more civilized than the underground. Plus, the peace of mind from knowing I wasn't heading anywhere I might be attacked made it a pretty nice change. But one day, as I was turning from Park Avenue onto East 47th, I heard someone shout my name. I was walking, eating my little box of halal cart street meat and fries, and I heard someone yell my name in a way that suggested they were happy to see me. That's the only reason I turned around. If they had sounded angry or literally anything other than happy like they did, I would have kept my eyes forward and picked up the pace, hoping to lose them in the crowd. But they didn't sound angry. They sounded almost excited. So I turned, expecting to see an old friend or co-worker or something. Instead, I saw a complete stranger, and the stranger ran up to me and just punched me square in the face. I fell backward, my street food spilled everywhere, and the stranger ran off, still yelling my name, but also adding things like, "You suck, pal, you suck." This was in New York, so only 3 of the maybe 24 people who saw me get punched came over saying, "Oh damn, you okay, man?" and checked on me. Needless to say, I wasn't okay. By that point, a few days had passed without anything happening. I had a ton of stuff to deal with, to get my car back in drivable condition and find a new place to live, and I still had the mystery of all this weighing on me. But there was a brief period where I thought the worst was over. Something weird and messed up was going on, but once they figured out where I lived, finding me was a piece of cake, I guess. But after the punch, I realized that they, whoever they were, somehow could track me during my commute to work. Realizing I wasn't safe anywhere, possibly not even in my damn hotel room, took everything to a whole new level of stress and fear for me. It might sound dramatic to some, so I better say it like it is. I literally wanted to run home to my mom and dad. I didn't know who else to turn to because the police were only just starting to take things seriously, and by then, obviously, I was in something way bigger than I could handle and in serious danger. But the real dilemma was knowing that if I headed to my parents' house, I might bring my attackers there and put my parents at risk too. I couldn't even tell them how bad the situation had gotten because I knew they'd insist on stepping in somehow, which again might put them at risk. I had the police and my boss, because once they understood how serious the situation was, my employers were very understanding and basically put me on indefinite paid leave until the whole thing could be sorted out. Between the police, my bosses, my co-workers, my soon-to-be former landlords, and my potential new landlords, my phone was very active. I spent long stretches returning calls and replying to texts, and I got very used to seeing my screen light up with unknown and withheld numbers. A few nights later, I was in a different hotel room when my phone started buzzing on the desk with private number written across the screen. I didn't hesitate for a second, swiped to answer the call, brought the phone to my ear, and was greeted by someone very articulate and confident with a very deep voice. When the guy used my name, I thought it was a cop or someone responding to a rental application I'd sent out, but I slowly realized the call was from someone very different. He knew a lot about me and seemed to use the information to confirm it was really me he was talking to. He used my name, named my employer, even knew the address of my old apartment, the one I was planning to abandon. I only answered one or two of his questions before politely asking why he was calling. That's when he introduced himself as Odin. Odin, who made it clear that wasn't his real name, worked for some tech company out west, and the reason he was calling was that he'd found some of my personal information online. At first, it was like, so what? Because I thought he was talking about my social media or the email address and phone number listed on my employer's website. But that wasn't what Odin was referring to. He said my name, my old address, pictures of me, and even things like my work history were available to read on a website he called DocSpin. That name meant nothing to me at the time. I wasn't even sure what he'd said exactly, but these days, I still get a chill when I read or hear it mentioned. For those who don't know, DocSpin was, or is, I heard it came back, but I can't say for sure, a website you can't access through your regular internet browser. It's located on what some people call the dark web, but Odin said it was more like the deep web. From what I understood, all you really need is a special browser, and you can see all the stuff you can't see on Chrome or Internet Explorer. Odin said I could see it for myself if I wanted to follow his instructions on how to download and install that kind of special browser, but after I agreed it'd be quicker if he sent me screenshots, he did, and I saw for myself what was written on that website. Someone, I had no idea who at the time, had not only listed all my personal information, but also claimed I had multiple convictions related to inappropriate activities with children. The post essentially said I was posing as my real self because I was a predator trying to relocate and start a new life after charges were filed in Ohio and Illinois. That's when it all clicked. The random guy trying to intimidate me, the people defecating on my door, trashing my car, and punching me in the face, all tied to that initial standoff. Only that initial standoff came as a result of this wild online accusation from what I thought was a completely anonymous source. But it wasn't anonymous, not entirely. And not only had Odin used his computer magic to figure out whose post it was, but he seemed more than happy to share what he'd learned. Now, from what I understand, the dark web or deep web is mostly accessible only through anonymous browsers, and the vast majority of posts on DocSpin were from anonymous users. But Odin decided to do some digging to find out who I'd pissed off so badly that they'd want to ruin my life. He Googled my name, but didn't find much, so he looked into the charges and found out the whole DocSpin post was just an elaborate lie. Then he went back to trying to figure out who was mad at me and ended up looking into people who had recently parted ways with the market research company I worked for. He found a guy who seemed to know his way around a Tor browser, a case of it takes one to know one. Then he discovered this kindred spirit had a blog on the surface web, something he could check out at his leisure, and that's when he realized the writing styles of his posts and the one on DocSpin doxing me were almost identical. Odin explained all that over the course of 1 or 2 minutes before I practically begged him to tell me the suspect's name. And when he did, it was like a holy crap moment where everything suddenly fell into place and started making sense. I don't want to say the guy's name. I'd rather take the high road and not dox the doxer, so to speak. But I immediately recognized the name from a review I'd done, which, coincidentally, had contributed to this guy's termination from the company. He was lazy, sloppy, rarely showed up on time, and barely got his work done. But apparently, beneath the greasy surface, our boy was as skilled with a computer as he was vindictive. And when he found out I was the one who did his review, well, my fate was sealed. I remember sitting on the hotel bed, phone in one hand, head in the other, massaging my temples between my thumb and ring finger, trying to fend off the impending mental headache. I think it was a case of too much information at once, plus going back and forth between thinking the call was just another prank and believing Odin was genuine. But I think by the time he mentioned the name of the guy who got fired, I realized Odin knew too much about everything for it to be a hoax. He was also willing to share everything except his identity, so unless it was an elaborate scam, he seemed to be genuinely on my side. But here's where the paranoia came back with a vengeance. Toward the end of the call, Odin asked for money. He claimed he could get the post about me taken down, but since it was a time-critical situation, the longer it was up, the longer I'd be at risk. He'd need help getting into the website to do the work. That meant asking some friends if they'd help him out, and those friends would need some financial compensation for their efforts. Basically, if I wired Odin a few thousand in Bitcoin, he could make it all go away. Immediately, alarm bells started ringing in my head. In fact, I straight up asked him if he was the one who posted my information as a roundabout way of extorting me to get it taken down. He laughed nervously and then admitted it had a certain twisted genius. But if all he wanted was money, there were 100 ways he could scam or extort me without taking the time to call and explain this whole awful situation. That was another thing that convinced me he was legit. I'm very aware he could have been playing the long game, and maybe the con was, I don't know, all part of the game for him. But whoever Odin was, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse, one that was in such good faith that he offered to take the post down before asking for payment. He didn't need to spell out what he was capable of doing if I decided not to pay him, and I had a good idea from experience. So I did, but not before 10 full days passed without incident. He checked in every day as a reminder that I owed him, but also just to make sure nothing else had happened. He said there was a good chance my old apartment would be targeted again, but only by guys who already knew where I lived and still thought I was some kind of child predator. But with the post taken down, he hoped there wouldn't be anyone else planning to teach me a lesson, or however the guy's post had worded it. I was skeptical. I mean, there was still that voice in the back of my mind saying I'd been conned. But as the days went by and there were no more incidents at my old apartment building, that voice got quieter and quieter before shutting up completely by the 10th day. I converted Odin's money into Bitcoin and finally sent it to his wallet in this very involved process. Then he called to offer a brief word of thanks, but the call ended with me thanking him profusely too. It turned out that when we ended the call, I decided to call him back just a few minutes later to ask if I could ever hire his services again if I needed them. But no sooner had I dialed than I heard this dull tone. The number had been disconnected. A few days passed, and the more I thought about this whole mess, the more that paranoid feeling started creeping back. I became more and more convinced that Odin had been behind the whole ordeal, at least until I realized there was a way I could check if what he told me was true or not. I called in a favor from one of the HR ladies, and then, one afternoon, while still in that hotel room, I dialed a number I had written on a piece of paper and pressed call. Seconds later, I heard a voice on the other end of the phone. It was the guy whose review I'd done, the one who ended up getting fired as a result. After putting on the cheeriest voice I could muster, I started talking. I told him who I was, told him I'd heard about his firing, and then told him how sorry I was. He sounded surprised, but not scared, so I kept going. I told him I'd heard about a possible opportunity at another company and asked if he wanted me to keep him posted on any openings. Again, he sounded confused, but said sure, he'd like that. I ended the call saying how nice it was to catch up with him. It was all a lie, but one I wanted to gauge his reaction with. I wanted to hear the hatred in his voice. I wanted anything that would confirm he'd been motivated to try to ruin my entire life. But what gave him away was this. Just as I was about to hang up, and we were wrapped up in that rambling exchange of "thanks for calling" and "talk soon maybe," I said, "I know what you did." I think an innocent person, at the very least, would have responded with something like, "Huh? Did what?" But he didn't say a damn word. For a brief moment, it sounded like he was going to say something, like he was thinking or deciding on some witty comeback to make me look foolish. But he didn't. He just hung up. And that was all I needed. Odin hadn't lied to me. Or if he did, he was in cahoots with the guy who posted it, and then I'd have to tip my hat to a well-orchestrated con. But something about the way the guy didn't say anything, it was almost like he knew he was being recorded, or you can bet your ass that I recorded everything using my laptop's camera, just in case I managed to force an admission. He knew he couldn't prove anything, not if he kept his mouth shut and didn't brag about it. So, in the end, I guess he got away with it. But I got what I wanted. What seemed more important than anything else at the time was peace of mind. I saw the cause and effect as clear as day, and while it was a hell of a ride, I could finally make sense of what had been happening to me. I don't live in New York anymore, not even on the East Coast, and I don't work in market research either. I'm happy, I'll say that. But at this point, I'm too burned out to post anything too revealing in online spaces. And to anyone reading this, I implore you, be very careful with the personal information you allow to be posted online, because there are some deeply disturbed people who will seize any opportunity to use it against you. It is widely agreed that following Hitler's invasion of Poland, the Second World War began on the 1st of September, 1939. However, some contend that the conflict truly ignited 8 years earlier, in September of 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria. In the mid-19th century, Japan remained under the iron grip of the Tokugawa shogunate, which enforced a medieval feudal system known as Shino-kosho, where samurai occupied the highest social tier. Additionally, its closed country policy, or shokoku, aimed to restrict trade, foreign influence, and the spread of Christianity. This policy fostered a flourishing of artistic and cultural advancements, but, as expected, the prohibition of free trade triggered severe economic downturns. By the mid-19th century, food shortages stemming from financial stagnation sparked violent peasant protests, exposing the shogunate's vulnerabilities and hastening its inevitable collapse. Ultimately, in 1868, Emperor Meiji was restored as the divine leader of the nation, marking the dawn of an era known as the Meiji Restoration. The Meiji Restoration was a pivotal moment in Japanese history for several reasons. Foremost, the nation began industrializing at an unprecedented pace with the introduction of steam-powered machinery. Japan's silk industry experienced an unparalleled boom, while the implementation of the country's first railway system skyrocketed productivity. Japan established a telegraph system, its first national bank, power plants, and large-scale factories, aiming to emulate the success of Britain and the United States, working closely with its new Western allies to propel Japan into the 20th century. This endeavor was a resounding triumph, and by the early years of the 20th century, Japan had transformed from an isolated island nation into a formidable regional power. Perhaps the finest illustration of Japan's progress was the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War. For centuries, control of the Korean peninsula had been a primary military objective for Japan, but Imperial Russia, with its significantly larger army and navy, believed it could easily sweep the Japanese aside in their bid to claim both Korea and northern China. Japan attempted peaceful negotiations, but the Russians seemed content to let war decide the outcome. This, however, proved a grave misjudgment. On the 9th of February, 1904, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet stationed near what is now the Chinese city of Dalian. It was a devastating blow, followed by Japanese victories at Liaoyang and Mukden. Russia's Baltic Fleet sailed over 32,200 kilometers to support its ground troops, but in May of 1905, the Japanese Navy obliterated the combined fleet in the Battle of Tsushima. Although it was already too late, the Japanese had made significant inroads into China's Manchurian province. Not only did their victories force the Russians to seek peace, in just 19 months of fighting, the Russians suffered around 160,000 casualties, while the Japanese, though enduring nearly 500,000 casualties, maintained exceptionally high morale due to the unwavering faith in their nation and cause. In September of 1905, a peace treaty was signed, with Japan gaining vast regions of Manchuria in a process mediated by the United States and the United Kingdom. The Japanese began to view Britain and America as potential allies, so much so that when the First World War erupted, Japan aligned with the United Kingdom and attacked German colonies in China and the Pacific. After a month-long siege, in November of 1914, they expelled German soldiers from the Chinese city of Qingdao and seized control of the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands. They also provided invaluable support to the Australian Navy in its pursuit of the German warship SMS Emden. Japan proved an exceptionally effective ally and was naturally proud of its contributions to the war effort. However, when peace arrived in November of 1918, the Japanese felt their efforts went unrewarded. Shocked by Western powers' orders to relinquish control of certain Pacific islands and disheartened by high tariffs imposed on their goods during the post-war period, amid a wave of protectionist trade policies, Japan's silk and agricultural industries began to falter. Then, in 1923, Japan was struck by the most devastating natural disaster in its recorded history, the Great Kanto earthquake. This earthquake is believed to be the worst in Japanese history, and the scale of destruction was simply staggering. Over half of Tokyo was razed by the quake or consumed by the fires that followed, while the port city of Yokohama was nearly obliterated, with over 90% of its structures reduced to rubble. The cities of Kawasaki and Yokosuka suffered extensive fire damage, and numerous villages and towns in the prefectures of Kanagawa, Saitama, and Ibaraki were severely impacted. In just 4 minutes and 48 seconds, centuries of labor and progress were devastated. Japan's heartland lay in ruins, and it was here that the first seeds of militarism were sown, in the fertile soil of national humiliation and economic instability. Without a stable peacetime industry, the Japanese populace turned to their generals for purpose and guidance. The days of warring against Russians and Germans had been glorious, filled with pride and productivity. As factory gates closed, the ranks of the imperial army swelled dramatically. Japanese generals vowed to lead the citizenry as they had their soldiers to victory at any cost. They preached the doctrine of Kokutai, demanding absolute loyalty to the emperor and the state, and revived the ancient samurai ethos of Bushido, where supreme honor lay in glorious sacrifice. The glorification of Japan's military victories permeated schools, where martial values were instilled. The Japanese were taught they were a divine people, and the nation was destined for expansion. Any public figure or politician suggesting otherwise became a target for assassination by violent militants or members of the Japanese military. By 1931, despite their reverence for the divine Emperor Hirohito, the Japanese military held total control of the state apparatus. For years, they had been preparing for war. It was not a question of if, but when, and every soldier in the Imperial Army knew they only had to wait. That is, until a soldier stationed in the Japanese section of the South Manchuria Railway grew tired of waiting and devised a plan. On the night of September 18th, 1931, Colonel Seishiro Itagaki pondered the Japanese concept of gekkokujo, a term describing when someone in a lower position overthrows a superior through military or political power. In Itagaki's view, Manchuria offered the perfect opportunity for gekkokujo. The local Chinese garrison in Shenyang appeared poorly trained and unmotivated, while Itagaki's troops were disciplined, well-equipped, and eager to fight. He knew that, under the circumstances, he and his soldiers would deliver a crushing defeat to the numerically superior Chinese. To seize that opportunity, he decided to manufacture consent. That night, Itagaki ordered one of his soldiers to place explosives near the railway tracks. When those explosives detonated, Itagaki reported to his superiors that they were under attack by Chinese artillery and pleaded for the chance to subdue the local garrison. Permission was granted, and by the next morning, 2 Japanese artillery batteries opened fire on the Chinese garrison. The infantry assault that followed was so swift and ferocious that a Japanese force of just 500 men defeated over 7,000 Chinese soldiers. The Pacific War had begun, and when Japan's prime minister attempted to halt it, he too was assassinated in cold blood. China had been embroiled in civil conflict since the 1920s, and though Japan had invaded territory now part of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese and Japanese governments were not yet officially at war. That changed in July of 1937 when, following a clash with Chinese forces, Japan formally declared war and launched a full-scale invasion of the Republic of China. By August, the Japanese had captured Shanghai, but not without fierce resistance and numerous casualties. Outnumbered and far from home, Japanese General Iwane Matsui realized a decisive blow was needed to collapse the Chinese government and end the war. Thus, he offered to lead his army on a march to what was then China's capital, Nanking. Chinese General Tang Shengji declared that he and his garrison of 81,000 soldiers would defend Nanking to the death, but government officials, recognizing the defenders consisted of untrained recruits and wounded veterans, evacuated the city less than a week before Japanese troops arrived. It wasn't just their rapid advance that terrified the Chinese, but what the Japanese did along the way that instilled dread in their hearts. Historian Peter Harmsen notes that the 274-kilometer stretch between Shanghai and Nanking became a nightmare zone of death and destruction. Japanese fighter pilots later confessed to strafing Chinese farmers with machine guns and 20mm cannons for, in their words, amusement. Marching Japanese soldier columns also subjected civilians to extreme violence and cruelty. In one instance, the residents of a village called Nenguo were locked in their homes under the pretense of enforcing a curfew, only for Japanese soldiers to set the buildings ablaze, leaving nothing but ashes where a village and its people once stood. When a mother and her son returned and found their village burning, Japanese soldiers threw the 2-year-old boy into the flames, bayoneted the woman, and then tossed her bleeding body into a nearby stream. In another incident, a pregnant Chinese woman was beaten and raped so brutally she lost the ability to walk. Japanese soldiers then sliced open her abdomen, extracted the fetus, and subsequently gathered the remaining villagers and killed them with bayonets. A soldier from Japan's 13th Division, Kosu Tadanobu, wrote the following account of his unit's activities. "We took all the men behind the houses and killed them with bayonets and knives. Then we locked the women and children in a single house and raped them through the night. Before departing the next morning, we killed all the women and children, and to top it off, we burned the houses so that even if someone returned, they'd have nowhere to live." Another account, attributed to an anonymous Japanese journalist, attempted to explain the rapid Japanese advance. "The reason the 10th Army advances toward Nanking so swiftly," he said, "is due to the tacit agreement among officers and soldiers that they could loot and rape women as much as they pleased. Rather than face the horrors of the invading Japanese army, many Chinese civilians chose oblivion." First Lieutenant Nishizawa Benki witnessed an incident where 2 young Chinese women opted to drown themselves rather than face capture. Perhaps one of the most infamous crimes committed en route to Nanking involved 2 Japanese officers engaging in a friendly contest, a race to be the first to behead 100 Chinese prisoners. Sub-Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda rushed to decapitate every Chinese captive they could find with their razor-sharp Shin Gunto sabers. The contest was widely reported in Tokyo's Nichi Nichi Shimbun newspaper, as well as the English-language publication The Japan Advertiser, with both outlets providing regular updates. One edition of the Nichi Nichi Shimbun headlined, "Incredible record in the 100-person cutting contest. Mukai, 106. Noda, 105. Both sub-lieutenants go to extra innings." Mukai and Noda's counts were so close that it was deemed impossible to determine who reached 100 first. However, instead of calling it a draw, the 2 officers decided to continue their murderous contest until a clear winner emerged. In the year 2000, revisionist scholars in Japan and the United States argued the contest was an elaborate hoax to foster what they called national fighting spirit. This led to a lawsuit in 2005 filed by the families of sub-lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, who sought to clear their ancestors' war criminal names, but the suit was swiftly dismissed by a Tokyo district judge who affirmed that the sub-lieutenants had admitted to competing to kill 100 people on multiple occasions. On the 8th of December, 1937, with the Japanese army just 25 kilometers from Nanking's walls, Prince Yasuhiko Asaka arrived at the front. He was greeted by 2 lieutenant generals who proudly informed him that the Japanese had nearly encircled the 300,000 Chinese soldiers near Nanking, and preliminary negotiations suggested the Chinese were ready to surrender. However, instead of issuing orders to accept the surrendered soldiers as prisoners of war, Prince Asaka signed an infamous directive instructing his officers to kill all captives. It's critical to note that the Japanese considered all Chinese men combatants, regardless of age or physical condition, meaning that, for all intents and purposes, Prince Asaka had ordered the massacre of nearly every person in Nanking. On the 9th of December, despite the valiant efforts of Chinese defenders, the Japanese Imperial Army finally reached Nanking's city walls. After an intense 4-day battle, a combination of exhaustion and a total collapse in command and control led to the crumbling of Chinese resistance. General Tang Shengji issued a retreat order, and though many of his soldiers managed to escape to safety, the order didn't reach the ears of the so-called Chinese Supervisory Unit, which had been given strict instructions to execute all deserters. To their horror, many Chinese soldiers found themselves hunted not only by the Japanese, but also by their own compatriots, scouring the bomb-scarred urban landscape, shooting at them indiscriminately. On the 13th of December, with Chinese resistance sufficiently weakened, Japanese army units advanced to Nanking's city gates and breached them. That same afternoon, 2 small Japanese Navy fleets arrived on both sides of the Yangtze River, cutting off escape for anyone hoping to flee via its waters. Initially, the advancing Japanese soldiers were met with an eerie silence, but as they ventured deeper into the city, they encountered pockets of terrified Chinese soldiers. Having heard rumors of Japanese massacres, many fought to the end rather than face capture. After the Japanese began broadcasting messages to the besieged Chinese, promising clemency if they laid down their arms, tens of thousands surrendered. However, the Japanese didn't merely detain uniformed Chinese soldiers as prisoners. As mentioned earlier, they considered nearly all adult males enemy combatants. In one incident, approximately 20,000 Chinese prisoners were taken to a supposed detention facility near the village of Mufushan on the banks of the Yangtze River. Each was told their surrender meant they would be spared and was led to a large barbed wire perimeter surrounded by Japanese machine guns. They were told the machine guns were for security, forming the final line of defense in case of a riot among the prisoners. It was a lie. At dawn the next day, as tens of thousands of Chinese prisoners awoke and began to stand, the Japanese opened fire with heavy machine guns. Waves of Chinese prisoners were mowed down like wheat, and in the panic, they rushed toward the barbed wire perimeter. Dozens were shot and killed while attempting to climb the razor-sharp wire, forming human bridges for other prisoners to escape. Soldiers from the Yamada detachment were forced to fire on fleeing prisoners to prevent their escape. A storm of lead tearing flesh from bone. When it was over, Japanese soldiers had to wade through a field literally soaked with Chinese blood, then drag the bodies, all 20,000, to the Yangtze's banks before dumping them into the water. In mere minutes, tens of thousands of lives were extinguished needlessly, with the river that once sustained them now filled with their blood. In other incidents, Chinese prisoners were used for live bayonet practice, with soldiers taught to kill with a single thrust. Defenseless prisoners were tied to wooden stakes before Japanese soldiers were instructed to plunge their sharp bayonets directly into the prisoners' hearts. Some prisoner groups were doused with gasoline and burned alive. Others were beheaded, sometimes dozens at a time, by Japanese officers seeking to perfect their sword strokes. One Japanese officer, Shiro Azuma, later said, "When I tried to behead the first one, I don't know if he moved or I missed the strike. I ended up cutting only part of his skull. Blood spurted upward. I struck again, and that time I killed him. We were taught we were a superior race because we lived only for a human god, our emperor, but the Chinese weren't, and we felt nothing but contempt for them." As the Japanese began their cleanup operations, in which those capable of defending Nanking were slaughtered by the tens of thousands, the city was now primed for capture. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary present during the invasion, wrote the following entry in her diary on the 15th of December, 1937. "The Japanese have looted extensively yesterday and today, have destroyed schools, killed citizens, and raped women. 1,000 disarmed Chinese soldiers, whom the International Committee hoped to save, were taken from them, and by this time have probably been shot or bayoneted. Many survived the fighting by staying in what became known as the Nanking Safety Zone, located in the western part of the city and marked by international Red Cross symbols. The Japanese agreed to avoid the safety zone provided no Chinese military presence existed. The zone was established by German businessmen and avowed Nazi John Rub and sheltered the 22 foreign nationals who remained in Nanking after the Japanese arrived. This group attempted to provide refuge to as many Chinese civilians as possible, especially women and girls, and at its peak, the safety zone reportedly housed nearly 10,000 vulnerable Chinese. Japanese soldiers were astonished to find a group of foreigners in the city's midst, particularly a group that refused to leave when given the chance. But when it was explained that the safety zone was off-limits by order of their superiors, the Japanese generally respected its sanctity. However, John Rabe wrote that as days passed, Japanese soldiers began entering the safety zone to abduct dozens of women at a time. Few returned. During the months of December and January, those remaining in the safety zone began documenting the Japanese war crimes they personally witnessed. They recorded a total of 450 cases, all sent to the Japanese embassy without response. Some of these records include Case 5. On the night of the 14th of December, there were many cases of Japanese soldiers entering houses, raping women, or taking them away, which created panic in the zone, and hundreds of women moved to the Ginling University campus. Case 10. On the night of the 15th of December, several Japanese soldiers entered the University of Nanking buildings at Taoyuan and raped 30 women on the spot. Case 13. On the 18th of December, at 4 in the afternoon, Japanese soldiers demanded a Chinese man surrender his cigarette case. When he hesitated, one of the soldiers stabbed him in the head with his bayonet. The man is now in the university hospital and is not expected to survive. Case 14. On the 16th of December, 7 girls aged 16 to 21 were taken from the military college. Only 5 returned, and each girl was raped 6 or 7 times daily. Case 15. There are about 540 refugees crowded in numbers 83 and 85 Canton Road. Over 30 women and girls have been raped. The women and children cry all night. Conditions inside the compound are worse than we can describe. Please give us help. Case 16. A Chinese girl named Lo was shot in the head by a Japanese soldier. The girl was 14 years old. The incident occurred near the Kulingsai Temple, on the border of the refugee zone. Case 19. A 62-year-old woman was attacked in her home in Hansi-men. Japanese soldiers decided she was too old to rape, so they tortured her instead. To the horror of Western observers, they noted that Japanese soldiers attacked Chinese women and girls at an alarming rate, but it wasn't a handful of platoons or companies committing such war crimes. It was the entire Imperial Army, doing so on an industrial scale. Having anticipated an easy victory over a people they deemed inferior, the Japanese were frustrated, exhausted, and enraged by the tenacious resistance they faced. With the city wholly defenseless after their hard-won victory, the conditions were ripe for one of humanity's worst collective crimes. In the first 4 weeks after the Japanese entered Nanking, approximately 20,000 rape cases were recorded, with some experts claiming the actual number could be as high as 80,000. If those experts are correct, it would mean the 50,000 Japanese soldiers occupying Nanking committed 2 rapes per minute for an entire month. Japanese soldiers targeted women of all ages, and in most cases, victims were executed and mutilated following what were often gang rapes. Toru Kosu, a former private in the Japanese army, recalled, "Women suffered the most. No matter how young or old, none could escape the fate of being raped. We sent coal trucks into the city streets and villages to seize many women, and then each was assigned to 15 to 20 soldiers to abuse them, and afterward we killed them. On the 19th of December, 1937, Reverend James M. McCallum wrote in his diary, "I don't know where to end. Never have I heard or read such brutality. We estimate at least 1,000 rape cases a night, and many by day. In case of resistance or anything seeming like disapproval, there is a bayonet stab or a bullet. People are hysterical. Women are being carried off every morning, afternoon, and evening, and the whole Japanese army seems free to come and go as it pleases and do whatever it wants." American reporter Edgar Snow wrote how mothers were frequently forced to watch their infants beheaded before being subjected to rape, while missionary George Fitch reported a woman had her 5-month-old baby deliberately smothered by a brute to stop its crying while he raped her. Robert O. Wilson, a surgeon at the University Hospital in the safety zone, wrote in a letter to his family, "The slaughter of civilians is appalling. I could go on for pages telling of rape and brutality almost beyond belief. Last night, the house of one of the university's Chinese staff was broken into, and 2 of the women, his relatives, were raped. 2 girls, about 16, were raped to death in one of the refugee camps. In the university middle school, where there are 8,000 people, the Japanese came in 10 times last night and raped until they were satisfied. They bayoneted an 8-year-old boy who had 5 bayonet wounds, including one that pierced his stomach, but I think he will live." Iris Chang, author of one of the most comprehensive accounts of the Nanking Massacre, estimated that the number of Chinese women raped by Japanese soldiers ranged from 20,000 to 80,000. Chang also notes that not all victims were women, and some Chinese men were forced to perform repulsive sexual acts as a form of ritual humiliation. As news of the mass rapes reached the chain of command, the commanding general expressed deep regret for the unfolding situation. General Iwane Matsui is said to have remarked to one of his civilian aides, "Now I realize that unknowingly we have caused a most grievous effect on this city. I am depressed and shall never be in the mood to rejoice over this victory. Personally, I feel sorry for the tragedies of the people, but the army must continue unless China repents." On New Year's Day, General Matsui confided to a Japanese diplomat that his men had done something very wrong and extremely regrettable. He later blamed the atrocities on the moral decline of the Japanese army, saying the Nanking incident was a terrible disgrace. "After all our efforts to enhance imperial prestige, everything has been lost in a moment due to the soldiers' brutalities." However, instead of punishing the Japanese troops responsible for the atrocities, the Japanese simply opted to open a series of brothels in their occupied territories. These so-called brothels were little more than depraved detention centers where female prisoners were raped in private rather than in public. Following Japan's surrender in September of 1945, the officers responsible for the Nanking atrocities were brought to trial. General Matsui was charged with deliberately and recklessly disregarding his legal duty to take adequate measures to ensure compliance and prevent violations of agreed-upon laws of war. Matsui claimed he never ordered the execution of Chinese prisoners, arguing he had directed his army division commanders to discipline their troops for criminal acts and was not responsible for their failure to follow his directives. However, Matsui was convicted by a majority of judges who ruled he bore ultimate responsibility for what was called an orgy of crimes. Others escaped justice entirely, such as Prince Asaka, who was granted immunity as a member of the imperial family, Orisamu Mutro, an aide to the prince, who committed seppuku during the Battle of Okinawa. Ultimately, on the 12th of November, 1948, General Matsui, along with 5 other convicted Class A war criminals, were sentenced to death by hanging. Their sentences were carried out on the 23rd of December, 1948. Hisao Tani, a lieutenant general who oversaw the massacre, was found guilty of war crimes, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad on the 26th of April, 1947. That same year, the 2 officers responsible for the 100-person beheading contest, Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, were arrested and extradited to China. Both men were found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death. They were executed by firing squad on the 28th of January, 1948. In recent years, revisionist historians have attempted to deny or minimize the horrific events that transpired in Nanking during the winter of 1937. This phenomenon mirrors Holocaust denial, as it not only seeks to absolve war criminals of their guilt, but also represents an insult to the memory of those who were killed. As humanity, we must always confront the brutal, unpleasant, or inconvenient truths of the not-so-distant past, for those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I live in Sarajevo, and the city is under siege. My family and I reside in a small apartment, and we scarcely venture outside because danger lurks at every corner. Gunfire and explosions echo constantly, a relentless reminder of the chaos engulfing our city. The windows of our home are shattered. We've covered them with plastic and blankets to try to keep out the cold. It's winter, and we have no heating. We bundle up in jackets indoors, but the chill seeps into our bones. We huddle together for warmth, sharing memories of better times to escape, if only for a moment, the harsh reality surrounding us. Securing food is a daily struggle. Sometimes we eat what we manage to grow on our tiny balcony, where we've planted some vegetables, but it's never enough to satisfy our hunger. Other times, we wait for supplies dropped by the United Nations from the sky, but snipers target the aid trucks, so provisions don't always reach us. When we do receive aid, it's like a small celebration. We feel deeply grateful for the solidarity of others. Some time ago, my brother went out to fetch water, as the taps no longer work, and we must trek to distant wells. He never returned. Later I learned a sniper had shot him. My mother now weeps often, lost in a silence heavy with sorrow. My father, meanwhile, is always busy, trying to fix something in the house or scrounging for food, perhaps to distract himself from the pain he carries inside. I'm not certain. We listen to the radio for news, but it's rarely uplifting. They speak of peace negotiations, but here nothing changes. Each day feels identical to the last. Explosions, gunshots, and eerie silence. Then more explosions, more gunshots, and word that someone else we knew has died. The violence seems endless. I attend classes in our building's basement, as proper schools no longer exist. We learn by candlelight, since there's no electricity. Our teacher shares stories of peace, of how Sarajevo was before the conflict began, but it's hard to imagine now. Those tales of normal life feel like fairy tales from a distant world. I miss my friends. Some have fled the city, others are gone forever. The classroom is quieter now, with fewer students each day. One day, I found a cat hiding beneath our building. It was scrawny and frightened. We took it in and shared what little food we had. Now it sleeps on my bed, and its presence makes the nights less lonely. Its purring is one of the few comforts we have left, a small reminder of life's joys. There are moments when a sudden explosion shakes us, and we all rush to the safest room, the one without windows. We sit there, waiting for the next sound. Sometimes, after an explosion, there's silence, and we think perhaps it's over, but then another blast comes. We've learned to fear the silence, knowing it may only be a moment before the violence returns. One day, there were no battles for an entire morning, so we went to fetch water. The silence was unsettling, but we knew it could resume at any moment. We ran to the well, filled our buckets, and hurried back. That night, we drank the water slowly, as if it were fine wine. Each drop felt like a precious gift, a fleeting moment of normality in a world turned nightmare. I dream of peace, of walking through the park without fear of snipers, of attending a real school, not a basement. I imagine a city where children play without fear, where families can sit down to eat without the constant threat of disruption. But dreams don't change the reality we live in. I write this in my diary because if we survive, I want to remember. I want to document our struggles, our resilience, and those brief moments of happiness we managed to find. I also write about the good things, like when we laugh over something small, or when the sun emerges after days in hiding. But above all, I write about the fear, the hunger, and the death. It's important to me that these experiences aren't forgotten, even though remembering them is painful. This is our life now. We don't know when it will end, but we carry on day after day because we must. Each morning, as we wake, we feel grateful for another chance to live, to love, and to cling to hope, despite all the despair. The siege continues in our city, but so does our will to resist and survive. This is a letter from my late great-grandfather, written in the summer of 1914. That summer carried a vibrant atmosphere, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. My friends and I, all hailing from the same small English village, were swept up in the patriotic fervor coursing through the country. When news broke that Great Britain was at war, it was as if a switch had been flipped within us. We gathered at the local pub, where the air buzzed with talk of duty, honor, and the promise of a grand adventure. Someone suggested we enlist together, and before we knew it, we were all nodding in agreement. The idea of a pals battalion where friends could serve shoulder to shoulder felt immensely appealing at the time. We had known each other since childhood, and the thought of facing the unknown without companionship was unthinkable. Together, I was convinced we would be invincible. So there we were, signing our names on the recruitment list, one after another, amid laughter, backslaps, and not the faintest clue of what truly awaited us. We were young, perhaps naive, but driven by a sense of camaraderie and the belief that we'd be home by Christmas, ready to dive headlong into the experience. Training was grueling, but sharing it with my friends made it bearable, even enjoyable at times. Yet, beneath all that bravado, there ran an undercurrent of something more solemn, something we couldn't put into words. We were going to war, but not to a mere local skirmish. We were stepping into a global conflict, and at that moment, I'm not sure any of us fully grasped the magnitude until it was too late. When we marched to the train station, the entire village turned out to bid us farewell. Our families, neighbors, even the school children. They cheered and tossed flowers as the local brass band played. But I could see the worry in my mother's eyes and the forced smiles on my father's face, trying not to dampen the moment. We didn't know then what we had signed up for, The mud, the gas, the endless trenches. All we knew was that we were doing it together, as comrades. And as the train pulled away amid cheers and waves, a small, frightened part of me wondered if this was truly the adventure we all imagined. By 1915, we were stationed in a place called Ypres in Belgium. The days were monotonous, filled with mud, rain, and the constant rumble of artillery. We thought war would be thrilling, but no one warned us about the boredom that punctuated the moments of action. We were ordered to stay on high alert for possible gas attacks, but we didn't truly believe the Germans would do something so horrific, not against the mighty British Army we'd been led to believe in. They drilled us to practice donning our masks in an instant and warned us of the devastating effects gas could have on its victims, but nothing could have prepared us for what actually happened. It was late afternoon when, suddenly, the air began to smell strange, a mix of rotten eggs and bleach. I remember seeing the sky turn yellowish. Someone shouted, "Gas! Gas! Gas!" and we all scrambled to put on our masks. I managed to get mine on, but not before inhaling a bit of the tainted air, and it was agony. Still, I managed to breathe properly afterward, but around me, chaos reigned. Men were coughing, choking, some collapsing before they could even reach their masks. I saw my friend Robert struggling to put his on, but it was too late. He fell to the ground, gasping, but all that filled his lungs was that deadly gas. It was thick, so thick, like a heavy fog you could see, but not touch. It burned my eyes, even through the mask, and I heard men screaming, some running blindly, others simply lying where they fell. We'd been told to stay low, as the gas was heavier than air, but that meant being close to the dead and dying. We waited what felt like hours. The gas dissipated slowly, but the damage was done, and it was catastrophic. When I removed my mask, the putrid stench still lingered in the air, and all I could hear were the moans of those suffering and dying. We had to move the wounded, and there were so many we didn't know where to begin. I saw men with burns on their skin, their eyes red and swollen shut, some coughing up blood. To me, it was a vision of hell. That night, no one could sleep. Every cough, every wheeze, reminded us of the gas attack. I kept my mask close, even inside our underground shelter, and we were all terrified it might happen again during the night, waking us too late to do anything but cough, choke, and die. That night was bad enough, but it was the next day when we saw the full extent of the horror. The bodies of friends and foes mingled, some contorted in agony, others appearing merely asleep. We had to bury them quickly. There was no time for proper burials, just a pit in the earth. I helped carry Robert's body. It was heavy, but I felt nothing but a deep numbness. There were no tears left in me. We covered him with dirt, and I said a silent prayer, not just for Robert's soul, but for all of us still alive, who had to keep facing the horrors of war. May Christ be with us. The days that followed were filled with dread. Every sound, every shift in the wind made us think the gas was coming back. We were told they had used mustard gas, something new and terrible. It didn't just kill instantly, it could kill you slowly, with blisters, with lungs that would never work right again. I survived that attack, but I was never the same. My lungs ached for months, and I'd wake up coughing, thinking the gas had returned. I saw men who survived the gas only to die later from their injuries. I write this so you know I came out of that war a different man. The memories of that day, the smell, the sounds, stayed with me. I've learned to live with those memories, but I've never forgotten them. I know true peace will only come when I'm as dead as poor Robert. Rest his soul. I hope to see you soon. A few months ago, a co-worker discovered I had served in the Marine Corps. I don't talk about it much, and my life took such a drastic turn after leaving the service that, at first glance, no one would peg me as a former military man. So, when he found out, he was so shocked that he came to ask me if it was true. The story of how he learned about it is pretty dull, so I don't think you'd care if I skip it. Since he and I had grown fairly close over the years, I didn't mind answering all his questions. I ended up sharing some funny anecdotes from my days at Paris Island, and then, inevitably, we got to the topic of overseas deployments. I told him I was in Iraq from 2004 to 2005, and more specifically, that I took part in what became known as the Second Battle of Fallujah. At one point, he asked if it was scary, and while that might seem like a simple question at first, it called for a complex, multifaceted answer. Of course, there were moments when I felt fear, genuine dread, but during most of the firefights I was involved in, what I remember most is feeling rage. When someone starts shooting at you, yes, the adrenaline surges faster than you can shout, "Incoming fire!" But it's like a fleeting moment of absolute terror, and then you and your platoon mates are like, "Oh, you're feeling brave today, huh?" And you're just furious. I felt more fear for others than for myself. If I was the one running from building to building, I was focused on 100 things, but not so much on my own safety, if that makes sense. Because I was doing my job, protecting my buddies. But if it was someone else doing something dangerous and I could see it happening, that was much worse, because it was like asking myself, am I about to watch one of my friends die right now? And sadly, sometimes that's exactly what happened. But that initial fear upon making contact with the enemy and the worry that your buddies might die weren't the same as what I'd call horror. When I talk about horror, I mean a fear so intense it pushes you to the edge of panic, to losing control, the kind of feeling that hits when something starts to seem almost supernatural, and all you want, as they say, is to get the hell out of there because you're completely out of your element. Imagine the terror you'd feel if you saw someone turn into a werewolf in real life. It's not just fear or confusion. It's like the laws of reality, as you know them, break apart. A mind-bending, soul-shattering experience that makes a grown man wet himself from sheer dread. I only felt that sensation once in my entire military career, and it was in a half-built, 2-story house in a Fallujah neighborhood called Jolan. Without diving into too many strategic or historical details that might bore you, Fallujah was probably the toughest battle the Marine Corps faced since the city of Hue in Vietnam. Plus, we were up against a very different enemy in Fallujah compared to other areas in southern Iraq. You had Shia militias like the Mahdi army, while in Baghdad there were a lot of former Iraqi army soldiers who'd gone underground and were waging an insurgency from the shadows. But in Fallujah, it was like an international all-star team of jihadists had assembled. The chance to take on the United States drew a lot of talent. Al-Qaeda-aligned terrorists from around the world converged on Fallujah, and many of them were still alive because they were incredibly skilled at what they did. The Second Battle of Fallujah came after the first one was a wake-up call for our commanding officers. The enemy was dug in like Alabama ticks, and they were being trained in urban warfare and bomb-making by guys who'd been fighting in various theaters for nearly 20 years by that point. As soon as they realized, our commanders pulled us out of Fallujah, called for reinforcements, and started working on a much more intricate plan to take the city without completely destroying it in the process. So, A few months later, there I was, fighting house to house with support from tanks and Cobra helicopters. In terms of combat, Fallujah was something like a chess game. Every building in a city block was like a square on a chessboard, and winning each engagement depended on where you had your pieces positioned. Just imagine playing chess, but you can't see some of your opponent's pieces until you place one of yours on the same square. That meant every now and then we had to send an assault team into a kill zone to secure a building on the enemy's flank. It wasn't an enviable task, because sometimes you got lucky and sometimes you didn't, and the enemy had a knack for surprising us in shocking ways. On one occasion, I was sent with 3 other guys to a building surrounded by a high wall. Intelligence had identified a single hole in the outer wall, which made the place ideal for defense, but also meant the enemy was likely using it, since they'd made the hole themselves. Intelligence hadn't detected movement around the building, but that obviously didn't mean no one was there, so we had to be extremely cautious during the approach. We crept up to the wall, climbed through the waist-high hole in the concrete, and started moving toward the first door we saw. We stacked up outside, but as we did, we heard a guy inside yelling a name in Arabic because he'd heard us and thought we were his friends. He was shouting, "Mustafa, Mustafa." But when Mustafa didn't answer, we heard him start to panic. We knew we had to breach immediately, or this guy might alert his buddies. One of us kicked the door open, and as soon as it swung wide, our light machine gunner saw the guy right there in the hallway, in front of him, AK in hand, with a look of pure shock on his face. The guy tried to raise his AK, but it was already too late. Our gunner hit him with a burst of about 15 rounds to the chest and stomach, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. We left his body there in the hallway, dead as a stone, and 3 of us went downstairs to secure the perimeter, while I stayed to watch a window overlooking the hole in the wall. It was a simple task: watch the hole and shoot anyone who tried to climb through it who wasn't American. A few minutes passed, and then one of my buddies from downstairs shouted for me to grab the dead guy's phone, since stuff like that was hugely valuable for intelligence. Since he had the entry point covered from an upstairs window, I could move without worrying about the enemy sneaking into the compound. I stepped out of the room, walked into the hallway, and instead of a dead body with 20 bullet holes, there was just a pool of blood and no body. The corpse was gone. I immediately said, "Guys, we've got a problem down here." Because obviously, dead bodies don't get up on their own. We'd already cleared the ground floor, so we knew there couldn't be anyone else inside with us. But what really freaked me out was that there were no drag marks, just a pool of blood, and then a few drops leading to another room at the back of the building. When I realized our corpse had simply gotten up after taking 15 to 20 shots, a chill ran through me. It made no sense, not by any natural law. I'd seen it with my own eyes, and I knew he was dead. So how the hell had he gotten up and walked away? One of my buddies came downstairs, and we started inching toward the door the blood drops led to. We decided to toss a grenade in first, but the moment the grenade went into that room, we heard boots on concrete before the wounded enemy came charging out with a knife raised over his head, ready to stab us. To be fair, a lot of times these guys would yell something before shooting or running at you, like this guy did, but this time he was completely silent, and his eyes were so wide they looked unnaturally large. As he rounded the corner with the knife raised, all I could do was backpedal to avoid being stabbed, but even though my buddy behind me shot him at least 2 or 3 more times, he kept coming at me with that knife. It was literally like a zombie movie. I was screaming, "Shoot him in the head, shoot him in the head," over and over, but my buddy had to get in close with his weapon at an angle where he wouldn't kill me too. It was a hairy moment for a bit, but finally, my buddy got close enough without getting stabbed and fired 3 times. Bam, 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 until the guy's head disintegrated and he stopped moving. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, okay, this guy's pulling my leg, because no one in the history of medicine survived 20 gunshots and kept fighting. Well, believe me, this guy did, and not because he was a zombie, but because he was high as a kite. Later that day, after a more thorough search of the building we'd taken, we found all kinds of needles and vials of adrenaline and amphetamines. These insurgents had been injecting themselves with that stuff, and then going into battle hopped up on stimulants to feel less fear and be more aggressive. It didn't work out too well for him, I guess, just made them mostly stupid. But when it came to taking wounds and still fighting, I never saw anything like it anywhere else. It really was like being in a zombie movie, and it wasn't just that guy. I know dozens of Fallujah vets who have stories like this, about having to shoot a guy in the head just to make him stop moving. I don't have many stories like that, just this one, but I'm sure you'll agree it's enough for a lifetime. My name is Marcus, and though I've lived a fairly ordinary life in the suburbs of a mid-sized city, there's a childhood memory that haunts me like a shadow that never fully fades. It's the story of my grandfather, a man the whole town regarded as a legendary hero. I grew up hearing his tales over and over, and for years I believed every word as if it were gospel. But over time, cracks in that narrative began to appear, and what I uncovered in the end not only shattered the image I had of him, but left me with an emptiness that still lingers in my chest. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, but by then I already knew the truth, and that truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. He wasn't a hero who saved a town from invaders. He was the monster who destroyed it. It all began when I was a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. We lived in a remote town, one of those places where time seemed to have stood still. I won't give the exact name, because even now, after all this time, there are people who defend his memory as if it were sacred. It was a place surrounded by wooded hills and abandoned fields, with creaking wooden houses and dirt roads that turned to mud with the slightest rain. My grandfather, whom everyone called Old Sam, was a central figure in that place. He'd been a farmer, a hunter, and according to local legend, a savior in times of crisis. Every Sunday, after family dinner, he'd sit in his rocking chair by the fireplace, pipe in mouth, eyes lost in the past, and begin telling his great story. The war came like a wolf in the night, he'd say, with that gravelly, deep voice that made us all lean forward. It was the winter of 1942, or maybe 43. The details blur with the years, but the terror that you never forget. He described how a band of outlaws, lawless raiders from the nearby mountains, had invaded our town seeking food, livestock, and women. They were savages, he said, armed with old rifles and rusty knives, led by a cruel man he called the Black Wolf for his thick beard and cold eyes. According to my grandfather, he and a handful of townsmen had organized in secret, gathering weapons hidden in barns and forming a small resistance group. We weren't trained soldiers, he'd explain, just farmers and lumberjacks with calloused hands and fire in our hearts. But when you see your people suffer, you become whatever you need to be. The story always unfolded the same way, with vivid details that painted an epic picture. The invaders had arrived at dawn, surrounding the town and demanding tribute. My grandfather, then a young man in his 20s, had led a nighttime ambush. We waited in the shadows of the trees, he'd recount, his eyes gleaming as if reliving the moment. We fired from the hills, caught them by surprise. I killed their leader with a clean shot to the chest, and the rest fled like rats before the light. He claimed they'd saved the town, protecting families and preventing a massacre. The townsfolk revered him for it. At local gatherings, they'd raise their glasses in his honor, calling him the guardian of the valley. I grew up idolizing him, imagining myself as him, a silent hero, defending his own against the shadows of evil. My school friends envied that I had a grandfather with such a grand story, and I retold it with pride, adding flourishes I'd heard from his lips. But as I grew older, something started to feel off. Around the age of 15, I began noticing small inconsistencies in his tales. One time, he'd say the invasion was in 1942, another time, 43. Details about the Black Wolf varied. Sometimes he had a scar on his face, other times a glass eye. I asked my grandmother, but she'd just smile and say, "Your grandfather has a selective memory, son. Stories grow with time." I thought it was just old age playing with his recollections, but the whole town seemed to back his version. At family gatherings, uncles and cousins added their own touches. "Sam saved my father that night," they'd say. Or, "Without him, the town would have been gone." It was like a living myth, and I soaked it all up. When I entered college, studying history, I started digging a bit. I searched local archives for conflicts in our region during the Second World War. Our town was in a rural area, far from major battle lines, and I found no mentions of bandit invasions or anything similar. I thought maybe it was a local event, unrecorded in larger histories. I asked my grandfather for more details, names of the invaders, exact dates. He'd get evasive, changing the subject with a laugh. "You don't need dates for a good story, Marcus. Courage is what matters." That irked me, but I let it go. After all, he was an old man, and his stories had inspired my love for history. A few years later, when my grandfather was in his 80s, things changed. I was home from college for the holidays, and one night after dinner, he pulled out his old memory box, yellowed photos, medals from the Great War. He'd served in the first, not the second, which was already an inconsistency, and a tattered diary. "Read it if you want, boy," he said. "Maybe you'll find answers." I read it that night, and what I found chilled me to the bone. The diary didn't speak of heroism against invaders. Instead, it described a group of townsmen, including my grandfather, who, in the post-war food shortages of 1947, not during the war, had formed a band to rob neighboring farms. They weren't defenders, they were thieves. They stole livestock, food, and in one entry, my grandfather wrote coldly, "We had to silence the family. Couldn't leave witnesses." He detailed how they entered a neighboring village, killing entire families to avoid being identified. Women, children, the elderly, they didn't discriminate. He described it as necessary for survival, but the words dripped with a coldness that turned my stomach. I couldn't believe it. The Black Wolf wasn't an invader. He was a fiction to cover their crimes. The town hadn't been invaded. They had done the invading. I rushed to confront him, but he was already asleep. The next day, I showed him the diary. He looked at me with weary eyes and sighed. "Not everything's like the stories, Marcus. Sometimes the truth is ugly." He admitted that, after the war, poverty had driven them to desperation. They formed a band, raided nearby villages, killing to leave no trace. "We were monsters," he said, but hunger makes you one. The town covered for them because many benefited from the thefts. Over time, guilt ate at him, and he turned his crimes into a heroic tale to justify himself. My grandfather passed away a few months later, but by then, I knew the truth. He wasn't a hero. He was a murderer. The town still venerates him, but I carry the weight of his sins. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I wonder if those spirits he invented were just the ghosts of his victims, whispering in his conscience. But there's no supernatural here, only human darkness, the kind that hides in the stories we tell to sleep soundly. And now, every time I visit the town, I feel that darkness lurking, reminding me that heroes are often just villains with good lies. My journey into the dark web began purely as an academic pursuit. I was in my second year of college, taking a cybersecurity module, when the topic came up in a seminar. It seemed like a mysterious, almost legendary corner of the internet that few truly understood. I read reports and watched documentaries, some sensationalized, others more accurate, and I was intrigued by the notion of this vast hidden network just beneath the surface. I won't lie, I was curious about the darker side, but that wasn't what truly drew me in. I wanted to understand the underlying technology, its structure, and the role it might play in the future digital ecosystem. Accessing it was easier than I expected. I downloaded the Tor browser, designed to anonymize online activity by routing traffic through a series of volunteer servers, and for extra caution, I used a VPN as an additional layer of protection. Navigating the dark web wasn't like using Google, where everything is indexed and accessible. Instead, you had to rely on directories like the Hidden Wiki to find onion sites and to learn how. I joined communities where dark web veterans shared tips. Once prepared, I started exploring. At first, my findings were, at best, surprisingly benign, and at worst, only somewhat unsettling. I found numerous resources dedicated to online privacy, like tutorials for using encrypted messaging apps or secure email services, and guides on evading surveillance. These weren't tools for criminals. A significant portion of the market seemed geared toward individuals like journalists and activists in repressive regimes, which was a fascinating angle I hadn't considered before. There were also many users who seemed like ordinary citizens, deeply valuing their digital privacy. However, while some were just trying to stay ahead in this evolving world of online activity, others displayed decidedly disturbing tendencies. For instance, there was a small group of users who believed they were victims of what's called gang stalking. Gang stalking refers to the belief that a person is systematically harassed by an organized group. They often describe constant surveillance, sabotage, social isolation, and orchestrated public harassment by strangers, acquaintances, or even entities like the federal government. While isolated cases of coordinated harassment have been documented, it's crucial to note that most gang stalking accounts lack any evidence and may stem from conditions like paranoia, anxiety, or other severe psychiatric disorders. The level of paranoia afflicting victims leads them to interpret everyday events as deliberate threats, sometimes with devastating consequences for their loved ones and associates. And some of the things I saw unfold in the gang stalking forum were as disheartening as they were alarming. People's lives had unraveled, but instead of accepting help from family or friends, they retreated, formed clandestine communities, and actively fueled each other's delusions, sometimes with what seemed like deadly consequences. For me, exploring the dark web started as academic curiosity, but quickly evolved into something deeper. It made me reflect more critically on privacy, surveillance, and how technology shapes our freedoms. The dark web didn't seem inherently good or evil. It was just a tool, and what mattered most was the intent of those using it. But the more time I spent digging, the more I inevitably stumbled across elements pointing to its darker side. It was gradual, almost like peeling back layers of something you're not entirely sure you want to see. There were hints of markets trafficking illicit goods, forums discussing activities that were clearly immoral or outright criminal, and these weren't things I actively sought out. They were just there, scattered among the benign content. But it was the rumors about so-called red rooms that marked my first tentative steps into the darker corners of the deep web. They were said to be live streams of events where unspeakable acts were carried out, often at the audience's behest. Some claimed they were digital urban legends, exaggerated or entirely fabricated to boost the dark web's notoriety, while others spoke of them with chilling detail, describing how to find hidden links and pay a steep price for access. Though I hadn't yet seen anything to confirm their existence, the mere idea was terrifying. What truly struck me about the darker corners of the deep web was how casually some people discussed such topics in certain forums. People talked about morally repugnant things as if they were mere innocent curiosities. It felt like I'd stepped into a world where social norms had been stripped away, and anonymity had created a space where anything, no matter how horrific, could flourish. Despite the darkness, I kept reminding myself why I was there in the first place: to understand, not to participate. I was careful to avoid clicking on anything suspicious or delving too far into places I didn't belong. Still, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what the dark web could be. For every encrypted email service or activist forum, there seemed to be an equally sinister counterpart lurking in the shadows. The rumors about the so-called red rooms lingered in my mind as I continued exploring. They were whispered in forums and chat rooms, but always elusive, always unconfirmed. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than digital urban legends, just the product of overactive imaginations. But the more I read, the more I realized they weren't entirely myths. It felt like a disturbing puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve, but I couldn't resist trying to uncover the truth. My search began in forums where users claimed insider knowledge. The posts were cryptic, filled with vague hints and coded language. Some described red rooms as pay-per-view live streams where horrific acts were performed on camera, often at the audience's request. Others dismissed the idea as impossible, pointing out the technical difficulties of streaming live video anonymously through Tor. Yet there were enough detailed accounts to keep me intrigued, making me wonder if some twisted corner of the internet had found a way to make it real. I followed the leads cautiously, moving through layers of forums, chat rooms, and directories. But the deeper I went, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The places felt heavier, darker even. I came across sites with names that felt like warnings, their black and white pages filled with ominous links. Some required passwords or cryptocurrency to proceed, and I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a line I couldn't uncross, but part of me was driven by the need to know. Were these just dead ends, or were they truly the real McCoy? The most unsettling moments came when I found threads where people claimed to have attended these supposed events. They spoke of encrypted invitations, exorbitant Bitcoin payments, and fleeting access to streams hosted on dark servers. It was all so surreal, but the way they described it felt disturbingly plausible. I never found anything definitive, no real link, no concrete evidence, but the process itself was chilling. The deeper I went, the more I realized that even the search itself carried risks, not just of stumbling onto something horrific, but of crossing a boundary I wasn't prepared to cross. Whether red rooms truly exist or not ultimately seemed irrelevant, because the pursuit itself had revealed a disturbing truth about what people are capable of imagining. I logged off, shaken by the experience, but also strangely relieved not to have found what I was looking for. The rumors remained just that, rumors, but the darkness I glimpsed along the way felt all too real. And in the end, it was that sense of being so close to finding something that dragged me back into the rabbit hole. I like to think she's still alive somewhere, that the system I helped dismantle gave her a chance at freedom, but I know that's not true. The dark web doesn't let its victims go easily. Still, I keep working, taking down one monster after another, because if I don't, who will?